Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case story. Story 1. A Murder Conspiracy. William M. Rice, 84 years of age, died at the Berkshire Apartments at 500 Madison Avenue, New York City, at about half after 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, September 23, 1900. He had been ill for some time, but it was expected that he would recover. On or about the moment of his death, two elderly ladies, friends of the old gentleman, had called at the house with cakes and wine, to see him. The elevator man rang the bell of Mr. Rice's apartment again and again, but could elicit no response, and the ladies, much disappointed, went away. While the bell was ringing, Charles F. Jones, the confidential valet of the aged man, was waiting, he says, in an adjoining room until a cone saturated with chloroform, which he had placed over the face of his sleeping master, should effect his death. Did Jones murder Rice? If so, was it, as he claims, at the instigation of Albert T. Patrick? These two questions, now settled in the affirmative forever, so far as criminal and civil litigation are concerned, have been the subject of private study and public argument for more than 7 years. Mr. Rice was a childless widower, living the life of a recluse, attended only by Jones, who was at once his secretary, valet, and general servant. No other person lived in the apartment, and few visitors ever called there. Patrick was a New York lawyer with little practice who had never met Mr. Rice, was employed as counsel in litigation hostile to him, yet in whose favor a will purporting to be signed by Rice, June 30, 1900, turned up after the latter's death, by the terms of which Patrick came into the property, amounting to over $7 million, in place of a charitable institution named in an earlier will of 1896. It is now universally admitted that the alleged will of 1900 was a forgery, as well as 4 checks drawn to Patrick's order, 2 for $25,000 each, 1 for $65,000, and 1 for $135,000, which represented practically all of Rice's bank accounts, an order giving him control of the contents of Rice's safe deposit vaults, in which were more than $2,500,000 in securities, and also a general assignment by which he became the owner of Rice's entire estate. Thus, upon Rice's death, Patrick had every possible variety of document necessary to possess himself of the property. Jones took nothing under any of these fraudulent instruments. Hence Patrick's motive in desiring the death of Rice is the foundation stone of the case against him. But that Patrick desired and would profit by Rice's death in no way tends to establish that Rice did not die a natural death. Patrick would profit equally whether Rice died by foul means or natural, and the question as to whether murder was done must be determined from other evidence. This is only to be found in the confession of the valet Jones and in the testimony of the medical experts who performed the autopsy. Jones, a self-confessed murderer, swears that upon the advice and under the direction of Patrick, though in the latter's absence, he killed his master by administering chloroform. There is no direct corroborative evidence save that of the experts. Upon Jones's testimony depended the question of Patrick's conviction or acquittal, and of itself this was not sufficient, for being that of an accomplice it must, under the New York law, be corroborated. In the confession of Jones the state had sufficient direct evidence of the crime, and of Patrick's connection with it, providing there was other evidence tending to connect Patrick with its commission. This corroborative evidence is largely supplied by the facts which show that for a long time Patrick conspired with Jones to steal the bulk of Mr. Rice's estate at his death. This evidence not only shows Patrick's possible motive for planning Mr. Rice's murder, but also tends to corroborate Jones's whole story of the conspiracy. Rice did not know Patrick even by sight. He had heard of him only as a person retained by another lawyer, Holt, to do the dirty work in an action brought by Rice against Holt, as executor, to set aside Mrs. Rice's will, in which she assumed, under the community law of Texas, where Rice had formerly resided, to dispose of some $2,500,000 of Rice's property. If Rice was a resident of Texas, she had the legal right to do this, otherwise not. Holt employed Patrick to get evidence that Rice still was such a resident. Rice knew of this and hated Patrick. Patrick's connection with the Rice litigation had begun 4 years before the murder, which was not planned until August 1900. His first visit to Rice's apartment was made under the assumed name of Smith for the purpose of discovering whether the valet could be corrupted into furnishing fictitious proof of Rice's intent to reside in Texas. He flattered Jones, told him he was underpaid and not appreciated, and, after a second visit, at which he disclosed his right name, persuaded him to typewrite a letter on Rice's stationery addressed to Baker, Botts, Baker and Lovett, Rice's attorneys, in which he should be made to say that he had lost hope of winning the suit against Holt, was really a citizen of Texas, and wanted to settle the litigation. Patrick said that he could arrange for the signing of such a letter and was willing to pay Jones $250 for his help. Jones agreed. Patrick now learned that Mr. Rice was living with no companion except Jones, that he held little communication with the outside world, that the valet was in his confidence and thoroughly familiar with his papers, and that the will made in 1896 disinherited natural heirs in favor of an educational institution which he had founded in Texas. He also learned that while Mr. Rice was 84 years of age, he was in possession of all his faculties, conducted his own business, and might live for years. Possessed of these facts, Patrick's evil mind soon developed a conspiracy with Jones to secure the whole estate. Mr. Rice's pet charity was the William M. Rice Institute for the Advance of Science, Art, and Literature, of Texas, which he had founded in 1891. He had donated to it more than $1.5 million. By the will of 1896 only. Small legacies were bequeathed to relatives, while the bulk of his fortune was left to the Institute. About a month after Patrick's first visit to the Berkshire Apartments, that is, in December 1899, while he and Jones were examining Rice's private papers, they stumbled upon the will. Patrick saw his opportunity. By the forgery of a new will, which would increase the legacies of those mentioned in the will of 1896 and leave legacies to every person who might have any claim upon the estate, it would be for the interest of those persons to sustain and carry into effect the forgery. The whole scheme was based upon the belief that every man has his price. He told Jones that he thought the will unjust, that he did not think it right to leave so little to relatives, and later he brought to Jones a rough draft of a will, which could be substituted for the genuine one. Patrick was to get half the estate. The relatives were to receive double or 3 times the amount provided in the 1896 will, and what was left was to be given to the Rice Institute. He proposed that Jones should typewrite this will, and guaranteed to arrange for the witnessing and signing of it, and promised that Jones should get whatever he wanted. Jones at first objected, but was finally won over. Rewritten many times to include new ideas of the conspirators, the document finally reached the form of the will of June 30, 1900, in which Patrick substituted himself for the Rice Institute and made himself one of the executors. An ingenious part of the conspiracy was the decision to leave the 1896 will in existence. If Patrick had destroyed it and the relatives had succeeded in overthrowing the will of 1900, the estate would have been left without testamentary disposition and the relatives would have got more than was provided by either will. With the will of 1896 in existence, however, the relatives would get less if they overthrew the forgery. By retaining it, therefore, Patrick figured that the relatives would have selfish reasons for accepting the forgery as genuine. The preparation of this bogus will occupied about a month, and the next question was the procurement of witnesses. It was desirable to get the same persons who witnessed the former will. These were Walter H. Weatherby and W. F. Harmon, clerks for many years at Swenson's banking house. On the assumption that Weatherby had been injured by Rice and was therefore hostile to him, Jones practically unfolded the scheme. He told Weatherby that one of Mr. Rice's bonds had disappeared and that Rice had accused Weatherby of stealing it. He wound up with the suggestion, "I will get one witness and you can get another, and the thing is done." But Weatherby indignantly declined to join in the conspiracy. Morris Myers, who had been employed in Patrick's office, and David L. Short, a friend of both, were the false witnesses finally selected. They were clothed with the appearance of honesty and were brought into contact with Rice by Jones at various times, Myers as a notary public, and Short as Commissioner of Deeds for the state of Texas, an appointment procured for him by Patrick probably for this specific purpose. The date of the forged will, June 30, 1900, was selected to correspond with the date of 3 genuine papers which Rice acknowledged before Short on that date. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. The next step was to obviate the absurdity of Patrick's being selected as the residuary legatee at a time when he was engaged in bitter litigation against Rice. The best way out was for Patrick to pose as a lawyer who had brought about a settlement of this expensive litigation and thus won Rice's regard. Patrick first tried to accomplish this by getting friends to visit Rice and urge a settlement. But Rice rebuffed them all. Accordingly, Patrick again resorted to forgery, and in August 1900, manufactured an instrument of settlement, dated March 6, 1900. But such an agreement would not explain the paradox of a man whom Rice hated and despised and did not know by sight turning up as the principal beneficiary under his will. It was necessary to manufacture evidence to be used after Rice's death in support of his claim of close relations. The idea of a personal meeting with Rice had been abandoned on Jones's advice, and Patrick therefore caused the valet to prepare 25 or 30 forged letters addressed to him and purporting to come from Rice. These referred to current business matters and conveyed the impression that it was Rice's custom to seek the lawyer's advice. One instructed Patrick as to the terms of the will of 1900. Carbon copies were made for filing in Rice's letter book after his death, to make assurance doubly sure and to secure immediate possession of Rice's securities. A general assignment to Patrick of all Rice's estate was forged, and an order giving him access to and possession of the securities on deposit in Rice's safety vault. But Patrick did not stop here. He procured from Jones 3 checks signed by Mr. Rice in the regular course of business, one payable to Jones for his July salary and the other two for the July and August salary of an employee of Rice's in Texas named Cohn. These 3 checks Patrick kept as models, forwarding to Cohn 2 forged checks filled out by Jones upon which Rice's signature had been traced, and returning to Jones a substitute check with Rice's signature traced upon it. All 3 checks passed through the bank's unsuspected traced signatures were also substituted for genuine ones upon letters dictated by Rice to his Texas correspondents. Thus Patrick secured the circulation of 5 copies of Rice's signature which, if occasion demanded, he could produce as standards of comparison to correspond with his other forgeries. The principal preparations were complete. But title under the will might long be delayed and perhaps even eventually fail. Patrick was poor and in no condition to conduct adequately a serious litigation. The moment Mr. Rice died, a large amount of cash would be necessary. For the procurement of this, Patrick and Jones looked to the current balance of Rice's bank account, which amounted to some $250,000 on deposit at Swenson's private bank and at the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. With this they felt reasonably secure of success. For even if the will should be set aside as fraudulent, they had a second line of defense in the general assignment of the estate and the orders to Rice's $2,500,000 of securities. While the evidence affords a motive for Patrick to desire the death of Mr. Rice, it does not of itself, up to this point, indicate the slightest intention on the part of Patrick to do away with the old gentleman. It was therefore conceded by the prosecution that, upon Jones's own testimony, the conspiracy to murder was not formed until about 7 weeks before the event. The first evidence which points to an intent to murder is the famous cremation letter, dated August 3d. The cremation letter from Mr. Rice, authorizing Patrick to cremate his body, shows that Patrick intended to do away with Rice in such a way that an autopsy must, if possible, be prevented and the evidence of murder destroyed. That Patrick forged such a letter was evidence that his connection with the murder was premeditated and deliberate. To cremate the body before an autopsy, it was necessary to procure a physician's certificate that Rice had died from natural causes. He therefore made preparation to secure such a certificate, and then upon the strength of the cremation letter to give directions for the immediate destruction of the body. Patrick, with the view of having at hand a physician who would be unsuspicious, and who would issue a certificate of death from natural causes, induced Jones to send for Dr. Curry, his own friend and physician, on an occasion when the valet was ill. This was in March, 1900. Dr. Curry came, and Jones, acting under Patrick's advice, cautioned him not to mention the lawyer's name to Rice. In course of time he saw Rice, gained his good opinion and became his attending physician. But Rice did not die, and curiously enough it was he himself who suggested to Jones the instrumentality of death which was finally employed, for he read an article dealing with the dangers of chloroform as an anesthetic, and discussed it with the valet. This suggestion was conveyed to Patrick, who asked Dr. Curry whether chloroform left any traces discoverable upon an autopsy. Dr. Curry rather carelessly replied that it left but slight traces if administered only in the quantities which would be fatal to a man with a weak heart. Patrick told Jones, so Jones alleges, to procure some chloroform, and this he did, sending to Texas for 2 bottles of 2 ounces each. From Dr. Curry's remarks it was manifest that a weakened condition of the patient was an important element, and as Jones was taking some mercury pills, prescribed for him by Dr. Curry, the valet induced his master to take some of them. The old gentleman was benefited, however, rather than weakened. This was before the forgery of the cremation letter. It was clear that larger doses of mercury would be necessary, and accordingly Patrick furnished Jones with pellets containing the drug in such quantities that Jones, experimenting with one of them, became ill. They had now the means to effect gradual death, but as mercury leaves traces discernible at an autopsy, it was decided that the body must be cremated promptly. Hence the cremation letter. It was hoped that Rice might drop off at any moment, owing to his weakened condition, and in anticipation of death. Patrick discontinued his visits to the apartment in order to establish a satisfactory alibi. Jones also frequently absented himself from the apartment in the evenings. After the old man had fallen asleep, the famous letter forged by Patrick, which requests the cremation of the remains of the supposed writer, old Mr. Rice. Last page of the forged will of 1900. Showing the forgery of Rice's signature, and the false attestation of Short and Myers. On September 16 Rice had an attack of acute indigestion, which might have resulted seriously had it not been for the mercurial pills which promptly relieved him. The reader should observe that practically all of this testimony comes from Jones. There is no extraneous evidence that Patrick induced the giving of the mercury. Patrick, however, spread false rumors as to Rice's general health and also as to his financial condition and intentions, namely, that Rice was only worth $750,000, and that those who expected he was going to leave his money to the Institute were doomed to disappointment. But neither his statements about Rice's condition nor his remarks as to the disposition and extent of his property are inconsistent with a mere hope that he would die and thus leave Patrick free to enjoy the fruits of his forgeries. There now occurred, however, an event which may well have played a part in inducing Patrick to supplement forgery by murder. On Sunday, September 16, the plant of the Merchants and Planters Oil Company of Houston, Texas, of which Rice owned 75% of the capital stock, was destroyed by fire. The company being without funds to rebuild, its directors telegraphed to Rice requesting him to advance the money. The amount needed was $250,000, and if Rice consented, all the available funds on deposit in the New York banks, upon which the conspirators relied to accomplish their object, would be exhausted. Jones endeavored to dissuade the old man from advancing the money, but without effect, and Rice sent a letter to Houston, agreeing to supply $150,000 and more in installments of $25,000 each. This was on September 18. After he had wired to the same effect on September 17. Patrick and Jones suppressed a telegram that Rice would advance $250,000, and on September 19 the old man received word that the first draft in conformity with his telegram of September 17 had been drawn and would arrive in New York on the 22d. Jones says that on showing this to Patrick, the latter announced that Rice must be put out of the way as soon as possible. Accordingly, on September 20th and 21st, Jones administered larger doses of mercury than usual, which, while weakening and depressing him, failed to cause his end. Saturday, September 22d, the draft was presented at Rice's apartment. The old man was not confined to his bed, but Jones told the bank messenger, after pretending to consult him, that Rice was too ill to attend to business that day and to return on Monday. That night Jones and Patrick met, and it was agreed, according to Jones, that Rice must not be allowed to survive until Monday. They still hoped that he might die without any further act upon their part, but Jones was informed by Dr. Curry that, although the old man seemed weak and under a great mental strain, he nevertheless thought that he would recover. This Curry also told to Patrick, the latter calling at the doctor's house about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. "You think Mr. Rice will be able to go down Monday morning?" Patrick asked. "You had better wait until Monday morning comes," replied Dr. Curry. "Do you think he will be able to go downtown next week?" persisted the lawyer. The doctor answered in the affirmative. That night Mr. Rice slept quietly until 8 o'clock Sunday morning. Dr. Curry called and found him in excellent condition, having eaten a hearty breakfast. His heart was a trifle weak, but it was sound. His organs were all working normally. He felt no pain. The doctor left without prescribing any medicine, stating that he would not return unless called, and expressing his opinion that the patient would recover. This was about 11 o'clock, and Jones immediately hastened to Patrick's house and reported the conversation. It was clear that Rice's death would not occur before Monday morning. He might live to pay over the $250,000, long enough to give further testimony in the Holt litigation, and thus expose the whole fraudulent scheme of pretended settlement and of friendly relations with the lawyer, and finally, perhaps, even to make a new will. The success of the conspiracy demanded that Rice should die that night. Did he die naturally? Was his death caused by any further act of the conspirators? Did Jones kill him by means of chloroform? Jones's story is that Patrick supplied him with some oxalic acid which was to be mixed with powdered ammonia and diluted in water, on the theory that it was preferable to chloroform since it would not require Jones's presence in the room. At the moment of death, Jones said that he endeavored to administer the mixture to the old man, but that he refused to take it. Jones had already procured the chloroform from Texas, as has been stated, and had turned it over to Patrick. He says that afternoon he procured this from Patrick, who told him how to administer it. This was a few moments after 6 o'clock. Rice was sleeping soundly. The colored woman who did the housework was absent for the day and the rooms were deserted. He saturated a sponge with chloroform, constructed a cone out of a towel, placed the sponge in the cone, put the cone over the sleeping man's face and ran out of the room and waited 30 minutes for the chloroform to complete the work. Waiting in the next room he heard the doorbell ring, and ring again, but he paid no attention to the summons. In point of fact he was never quite sure himself whether the bell was not the creation of his own overwrought brain. At the end of half an hour he returned to the bedroom, removed the cone from Rice's face and saw that he was dead. Then after burning the sponge and the towel in the kitchen range he opened the windows, straightened the rooms out, called the elevator man, asked him to send for Dr. Curry, and telephoned to Patrick that Rice was dead. Jones had no sooner telephoned Patrick that Rice was dead than the lawyer hastened to Dr. Curry's, and within 40 minutes appeared with him in Rice's apartments, assuming complete charge, summoning an undertaker and having the cremation letter at hand. He gave orders for speedy cremation. But he now discovered the principal mistake in his calculations. He had omitted to investigate the length of time required to heat the crematory. This he now discovered to his horror to be 24 hours. But the body must be destroyed. The undertaker suggested that the body might be embalmed while the crematory was being heated, and Patrick at once seized upon the suggestion and gave orders to that effect, although the cremation letter sets forth specifically that one of the reasons why Rice desired cremation was his horror of being embalmed. The body was embalmed at the apartments that night, Dr. Curry innocently supplying the certificate of death from old age and weak heart, and as immediate cause, indigestion followed by colorectal diarrhea with mental worry. Having arranged for the cremation at the earliest possible moment, Jones and Patrick rifled the trunk in which Rice kept his papers, and stuffed them in a satchel which Patrick bore away with him. The funeral was to be held early Tuesday morning and the ashes conveyed by Jones to Milwaukee, to be interred near the body of Rice's wife, while the relatives should not be notified until it should be too late for them to reach New York. The next step was to secure the $250,000 which Rice had on deposit. Patrick had already forged Rice's name to blank checks on Swenson and the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. Early Monday morning Jones, with Patrick looking over his shoulder and directing him, filled out the body of the checks, which covered all but $10,000 of Rice's deposits. These consisted of one for $25,000 and one for $65,000 on Swenson, one for $25,000 and another for $135,000 on the trust company. They were all made payable to the order of Patrick and dated September 22d, the day before Rice's death. One of the drafts on the Fifth Avenue Trust Company was cashed for him by a friend named Potts early Monday morning, and was paid without suspicion. But now came the second error, which resulted in the exposure of the conspiracy and conviction for murder. Jones, in filling out the $25,000 check on Swenson, had in his nervousness omitted the L from Patrick's Christian name, so that the check read Aber T. Patrick, and Patrick in his excitement had failed to notice the omission or attempt to obviate it by extra endorsement. This $25,000 Swenson check was intrusted to David L. Short for presentation to Swenson and Sons for certification. When he presented it, Wallace, the clerk, recognized Jones's handwriting in the body of it, and thought the signature looked unnatural. He took it to a rear office, where he showed it to Weatherby, who was the person whom Jones had approached 9 months before with the request that he join the conspiracy to manufacture a bogus will. Weatherby compared the signature on the check with genuine signatures in the bank, and returned it to Short without any intimation that he regarded it as irregular, but assigning as the reason the defect in the endorsement. Short thereupon returned the check to Patrick, who supplied the necessary supplementary endorsement and telephoned to Jones what had occurred, instructing him to say that the check was all right in case the Swensons should inquire. Half an hour later Short returned to Swenson's, where the check was examined by one of the firm. Rice's apartments were then called up, and Jones said that the checks were all right. But this did not satisfy Mr. Swenson, so he instructed Wallace to call up the apartment again and insist on talking to Mr. Rice. Jones delayed replying to Wallace and in the afternoon called up Patrick on the telephone, inquiring what he should say. Patrick replied that he would have to say that Rice was dead. And in accordance with this Jones informed Swenson that Rice had died at 8 o'clock the previous evening. It was thus clear to Swenson that although the maker of the check was dead, Patrick, a lawyer cognizant of that fact, was seeking to secure payment upon it. For Jones had told Swenson that he had reported Rice's death to the doctor and to Rice's lawyer. Patrick, accompanied by Potts, went immediately to the bank, where Swenson informed him that the check could be paid only to the administrator. Patrick replied that there would be no administrator, that Rice had left no property in this state, and informed Swenson that he had an assignment by Rice to himself of all Rice's securities with Swenson. He also invited Swenson to the funeral. Later in the day, Patrick attempted to obtain possession of Rice's securities in the Safety Deposit Company and in the Fifth Avenue Trust Company, by presenting forged instruments of transfer and the orders heretofore referred to, but after some delay the trust companies declined him access. The conspiracy had begun to go to pieces. The two mistakes and the failure to secure funds placed Patrick in a dangerous position. 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, 18 hours after the death, Jones, at Patrick's direction, began to notify the relatives that Rice had died the evening before, and that the funeral would take place the following morning. The telegrams to Baker and to Rice, Jr., in Texas, were in the following extraordinary form. Mr. Rice died 8 o'clock last night under care of physicians. Death certificate. Old age, weak heart, delirium. Left instructions to be interred in Milwaukee. With wife. Funeral 10 a.m. tomorrow at 500 Madison Avenue. It is significant that care was used to convey the information that the death was a natural one with a physician in attendance, that the body was to be interred in Milwaukee, without reference to the cremation. This may well have been so that, if any suspicions of foul play should arise, the recipients, realizing that they could not reach New York in time to arrest matters there, might hasten to Milwaukee to intercept the body, where they could be met by Jones with the cremation letter in his pocket and his urn of ashes under his arm. But the telegram did arouse suspicion, and Baker and Rice immediately wired Jones as follows: "Please make no disposition of Rice's remains until we arrive. We leave tonight. Arrive New York Thursday morning." Baker also instructed N.A. Meldrum, a Texan then in New York, to cooperate with Jones in preserving everything intact. In the meantime, however, Swenson had notified his attorneys, who in turn had informed the police and the district attorney's office, and that evening at about 11 o'clock James W. Gerard, accompanied by a detective, who posed as the lawyer's clerk, interviewed Patrick at his home. Patrick informed Gerard that he had an assignment of all Rice's property and also a will of Rice's of which he was executor. This was the first reference to the will of 1900. He also informed Gerard that he would not receive a cent under its provision. To have explained the real terms of the will would, under the circumstances, have excited too much suspicion. Yet he was eager to let the Swensons know that as executor he was in a position to control the profitable banking business that would arise from the settlement of the estate. In the meantime, 4 headquarters detectives, representing themselves as lawyers, visited the apartments. Patrick hurried to 500 Madison Avenue, where he learned of Meldrum's presence in town. Things were turning out far from the way in which he had expected. He then hastened to his office downtown, which he reached about 1:30 in the morning, and, alone, destroyed great quantities of paper, attempting to dispose of them through the toilet bowl, which was so clogged that the water flowed out upon the floor, necessitating an apology to the janitor. In the silence of the night, misgivings came upon him. He lost his nerve, and at 2 o'clock in the morning called up the undertaker and revoked the signed order for cremation, which he had given. Leaving the office at about 5 in the morning, he first visited Myers, thence proceeded to his own boarding house, and from there went to the apartments, which he reached at 8 o'clock. Here he found the detectives who had been on guard since early morning to forestall any attempt to remove the body. At the funeral itself he attempted to conciliate adverse interests and to win witnesses for his purpose. He had begun to do this the very night that Rice had died, when he told the elevator man that he was remembered in Rice's will. He had also informed Weatherby that he had a $5,000 legacy. At the funeral were Blinn, one of Rice's nephews, who had come on from Massachusetts, and two ladies, to each of whom he stated that they had legacies, which would soon be available provided there was no contest of the will. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. The detectives now informed Patrick that he was wanted at headquarters, and Patrick invited Potts to accompany him, informing the latter that the police suspected that there was something unnatural in the cause of death, but that he could explain satisfactorily. As a matter of fact, no such intimation had been made to him by the police or anyone else. At police headquarters, after an interview with Inspector McCluskey, he was permitted to go his way. Patrick returned to Rice's apartments, sent for Short and Myers, and conferred with them there. He took this occasion to tell Maria Scott, the colored woman who worked in the apartment, that she was suspected of having poisoned Rice, and that she had better say nothing about his death. Jones told her that she was remembered in the will and that it would be worth her while to stand by himself and Patrick, who would see that she was taken care of. Meanwhile, the coroner had sent the body to the morgue for autopsy. The autopsy was performed on Tuesday, 43 hours after death occurred, by Dr. Donlin, a coroner's physician, in the presence of Dr. Williams, also a coroner's physician, and of Professor R.A. Whitthos, an expert chemist. The 2 physicians testified at the trial that the organs of the body, except the lungs, were normal in condition, save as affected by the embalming fluid. They and Professor Whitthos agreed in their testimony that the lungs were congested. Dr. Donlin spoke of their being congested all over, while Dr. Williams characterized it as an intense congestion of the lungs coextensive with them. Outside of the lungs they found no evidence of disease to account for death, and beyond the congestion these showed nothing except a small patch of consolidated tissue about the size of a 25-cent piece. They testified, in effect, that nothing save the inhalation of some gaseous irritant could have produced such a general congestion, and that the patch of tissue referred to was insufficient to account for the amount of congestion present. Dr. Donlin could not testify what the proximate cause of death was, but was firm in his opinion that no cause for it was observable in the other vital organs. In this Dr. Williams concurred. He was of the opinion that chloroform would act as an irritant upon the lungs and cause precisely that general congestion observable in the case of the deceased. Professor Whitthos testified that his analysis revealed the presence of mercury, obtained as calomel, and while the amount was not sufficient to cause death, its presence indicated that a larger quantity had existed in life. The embalming fluid had contained no mercury, and he and Dr. Donlin agreed that the embalming fluid would have no effect upon the lungs beyond a tendency to bleach them. In other words, the people's evidence was to the effect that no cause of death was observable from a medical examination of the body save the congestion stated to exist in the lungs, and that this might have been caused by chloroform. Thursday morning Mr. Baker and F.A. Rice, the brother of the deceased, arrived in New York. Patrick showed them the cremation letter, and, inasmuch as they took a neutral position in the matter, ordered the cremation to proceed, and accordingly it took place that very day. He also endeavored to win the confidence of Baker, but succeeded in accomplishing little. He finally gave the latter a copy of the 1900 will and the original will of 1896. He also informed Baker that he had taken a large number of papers from Rice's apartments, and turned over to him a considerable number of them. He also surrendered on Friday the 2 Swenson checks. After considerable discussion, Baker told Patrick flatly that he would never consent to the probate of the 1900 will, that he was satisfied that the 96 will was the last will of Rice, and that he would insist upon its being probate, to which Patrick replied, that so far as he was concerned he did not know, but that the probate of the 96 will would suit him just as well as the probate of the 1900 will. That it was a matter of indifference to him, and that so far as the Rice Institute was concerned he was prepared to give Baker from $3 to $5 million for it, or any other sum Baker might name. These negotiations and conferences continued until the 4th of October, Patrick yielding step by step, until he had divested himself of all control of the documents and securities. Meantime, sufficient evidence having been secured, Patrick and Jones were arrested on a charge of forgery and held for the grand jury. Bail was fixed at $10,000 each, but was not forthcoming. On October 21, Mr. House, Patrick's lawyer, visited Patrick and Jones in the Tombs. Jones says that after Patrick had talked to Mr. House, the former called Jones to one corner of the room and told him that House insisted on knowing definitely whether a crime had been committed, and directed Jones to tell House that a murder had been committed, but that he, Patrick, was not concerned in it. This Jones declined to do without implicating Patrick. The two prisoners then returned to House, and Jones says that he informed House that he had killed Rice by chloroform, and gave him the same story which he told on the witness stand. After this, Jones apparently lost his nerve and told Patrick that he intended to commit suicide. This idea Patrick encouraged, agreeing that they should both do it at about the same time. On the 26th of October, Jones made a statement to Assistant District Attorney Osborne which was in large part false, and in which he endeavored to exonerate himself entirely from complicity in any of the crimes, and in which he charged the actual administration of the chloroform to Patrick. 4 days later, Osborne sent for him and told him he had lied, upon which Jones became confused, continued to persist in some of his statements, qualified others, and withdrew still others. He was completely unnerved, and that night attempted, by means of a knife which Patrick had supplied him, to cut his throat. The attempt was a failure, and he was removed to Bellevue Hospital, where he remained until November 12. He then finally gave the statement which corresponded with his testimony upon the trial, and which jibed with all the circumstances and evidence known to the district attorney. Did Patrick conspire with Jones to murder Rice? What corroboration is there of Jones's story that he killed Rice under Patrick's direction? First, what proof is there that murder was committed? Roughly, that Jones so swore that Rice died at the time alleged, that he did not die from disease, but that he died from a congestion of the lungs which could have occurred only in the case of a living organism by the administration of some such irritant as chloroform, that someone, therefore, must have killed him, and that Jones alone had the opportunity. Second, what proof is there that Patrick directed the murder? Evidence of an elaborate conspiracy, as briefly heretofore set forth, which contemplated the death of Rice. Of course Patrick wanted Rice to die. If Patrick Was not implicated in the killing. What motive had Jones to commit the deed? Why did Rice die at the precise psychological moment which would enable Patrick to prevent $250,000 on deposit being diverted to Texas? And finally, why did Patrick prepare a forged cremation letter for the destruction of the body? If the conspiracy contemplated a natural death, nothing could be of greater value to the two parties concerned than the means of proving that the death was not unnatural. This, in the most abbreviated form, is the case against Patrick. Space forbids any reference to his elaborate and ingenious defense, which was based entirely on an alleged complete failure of corroboration of Jones's testimony. Starting with the premise that the word of a self-confessed murderer and thrice perjured scoundrel was valueless as proof, he contended that there was no adequate evidence that Rice's death was felonious, and that the congestion of the lungs could have been and was caused by the embalming fluid and was only attributed to the chloroform after Jones had given his final version of how the murder was accomplished. Technically, the case against Patrick was not a strong one. Dramatically, it was overwhelming. His own failure to testify and his refusal to allow his lawyer, Mr. House, to relate what passed between them in the tombs remain significant, although not evidence proper for a jury to consider. Wherever lawyers shall get together, there the Patrick case will be discussed with its strong points and its weak ones, its technicalities and its tactics, and the ethics of the liberation of Jones, the actual murderer, now long since vanished into the obscurity from which he came. On the one hand stands a public convinced of Patrick's guilt, and on the other the convicted lifer pointing a lean finger at the valet Jones and stubbornly repeating, "I am innocent." For in 1906 the governor of New York commuted the death sentence of Albert T. Patrick to life imprisonment, and the most extraordinary struggle in the legal history of the state on the part of a convicted murderer for his own life came to an end. The defendant in the death house at Sing Sing had invoked every expedient to escape punishment, and by the use of his knowledge had even saved a fellow prisoner, Mike Brush, from the electric chair. Story 2. $500 million. This story, which ends in New York, begins in the department of the Gironde at the town of Montsayre, 75 kilometers from Bordeaux, in the little vineyard of Monsieur Émile Lapierre, landowner. In 1901 Lapierre was a happy and contented man, making a good living out of his modest farm. Today, he is well. If you understand the language of the Gironde, he will tell you with a shrug of his broad shoulders that he might have been a Monte Cristo had not Le Bon Dieu willed it otherwise. For did he not almost have $500 million, 2.5 milliards of francs in his very hands? Hein. But he did. Does Monsieur have doubts? Nevertheless it is all true. C'est trop vrai. Is Monsieur tired? And would he care to hear the story? There is a comfortable chair sous le grand arbre in front of the veranda, and Madame will give Monsieur a glass of wine from the presses, across the road. Yes, it is good wine, but there is little profit in it, when one thinks in milliards. The landowner lights his pipe and seats himself cross-legged against the trunk of the big chestnut. Back of the house the vineyard slopes away toward the distant woods in straight, green, trellised alleys. A dim haze hangs over the landscape. Sleeping so quietly in the midsummer afternoon. Down the road comes heavily, creaking and swaying, a wain loaded with a huge tower of empty casks and drawn by 2 oxen, their heads swinging to the dust. Yes, it is hard to comprendre 2,500 million francs. It was this way. Madame Lapierre was a Tessie of Bordeaux, an ancient bourgeois family, and very proud indeed of being bourgeois. You can see her passing and repassing the window if you watch carefully the kitchen, where she is superintending dinner. The Tessies have always lived in Bordeaux and they are connected by marriage with everybody from the blacksmith up to the mayor's notary. Once a Tessie was mayor himself. Years and years ago. Madame's great-uncle Jean had emigrated to America, and from time to time, vague rumors of the wealth he had achieved in the new country reached the ears of his relatives, but no direct word ever came. Then one hot day like this appeared MLE General. He came walking down the road in the dust from the Gare, in his tall silk hat and frock coat and gold-headed cane, and stopped before the house to ask if one of the descendants of a certain Jean Tessie did not live hereabouts. He was fat and red-faced, and he perspired, but he was distingué, and he had an order in his buttonhole. Madame Lapierre, who came out to answer his question, knew at once that he was an aristocrat. Ah! Was she herself the grandniece of Jean Tessie? Then, heaven be thanked, the general's toilsome journey was ended. He had much to tell them when he should be rested. He removed the silk hat and mopped his shining forehead. He must introduce himself that he might have credit with Madame, else she might hardly listen to his story, for there had never been a tale like it before since the world was. Let him present himself. MLE General Pedro Suarez de Moreno, Count de Tinoco and Marquis de la Dehesa. Although one was fatigued, it refreshed one to be the bearer of good news, and such was his mission. Let Madame prepare herself to hear. Yes, it would be proper for her to call Monsieur, her husband, that he might participate. Over a draught of this same vintage, MLE General imparted to them the secret. Lapierre laughs and shrugs his shoulders as he recalls the scene. The apoplectic General, with the glass of wine in one hand, waving the other grandiloquently as he described the wealth about to descend upon them. Yes, the General must begin at the beginning, for it was a long story. First, as to himself and how he came to know of the affair. It had been on his return from the Philippines after the surrender of Manila, where he had been in command of the armies of Spain, that he had paused for repose in New York and had first learned of the Tessie inheritance. The precise manner of his discovery was left somewhat indefinite, but the Lapierres were not particular. So many distinguished persons had played a part in the drama that the recital left but a vague impression as to individuals. A certain Madame Lucia, widow of one Roquefailer, whom he had accidentally met, had apparently been the instrument of Providence in disclosing the history of Jean Tessie to the General. She herself had been wronged by the villains and knew all the secrets of the conspirators. But she had waited for a suitable opportunity to speak. Jean Tessie had died possessed of properties which today, 70 years after, were worth in the neighborhood of $500 million. The General paused for the effect, solemnly nodding his head at his astounded auditors in a firm answer. Yes, it was even so. $500 million. No more and no less. Then he once more took up the thread of his narrative. Tessie's lands, originally farms, were today occupied by huge magazines, government buildings, palaces, and hotels. He had been a frugal, hard-working, far-seeing man of affairs whose money had doubled itself year by year. Then had appeared one Émeric Lespinasse, a Frenchman, also from Bordeaux, who had plotted to rob him of his estate, and the better to accomplish his purpose had entered the millionaire's employ. When Tessie died, in 1884, Lespinasse had seized his papers and the property, destroyed his will, dispersed the clerks, secretaries, notaries, and accountants of the deceased, and quietly got rid of such persons as stood actively in his way. The great wealth thus acquired had enabled him to defy those who knew that he was not entitled to the fortune, and that the real heirs were in faraway France. He had prospered like the bay tree. His daughter, Marie-Louise, had married a distinguished English nobleman, and his sons were now the richest men in America. Yet they lived with the sword of Damocles over their heads, suspended by a single thread, and the general had the knife wherewith to cut it. L'Espinasse, among other things, had caused the murder of the husband of Madame Lucia. And she was in possession of conclusive proofs which, at the proper moment, could be produced to convict him of his many crimes, or at least to oust his sons and daughter from the stolen inheritance. It was a weird, bizarre nightmare, no more astonishing than the novels the Lapierres had read. America, they understood, was a land where the rivers were full of gold, a country of bronzed and handsome savages, of birds of paradise, and ruined Aztec temples, of vast tobacco fields and plantations of thousands of acres of cotton cultivated by naked slaves, while one lay in a hammock fanned by a petite negra and languidly sipped eau sucrée. The general had made it all seem very, very real. At the weak spots he had gesticulated convincingly and digressed upon his health. Then, while the narrative was fresh and he might have had to answer questions about it had he given his listeners opportunity to ask them, he had hastily told of a visit to Tunis. There he had by chance encountered Marie-Louise, the daughter of L'Espinasse, living with her noble husband in a handsome oriental palace, had been invited to dine with them and had afterward seized the occasion while walking in the garden with the lady to disclose the fact that he knew all, and had it in his power to ruin them as impostors. Marie-Louise had been frightfully angry, but afterward her better nature had suggested the return of the inheritance, or at least 100 millions or so, to the rightful heirs. The general had left the palace believing all would be well, and had retired to Paris to await letters and further developments, but these had never come, and he had discovered that he had been deceived. It had been merely a ruse on the part of the woman and her husband to gain time, and now every step that he took was dogged by spies in the pay of the L'Espinasses, who followed him everywhere. But the right would triumph. He had sworn to run the conspiracy to earth. Many hours were consumed in the telling of the story. The Lapierres were enchanted. More than that, they were convinced, persuaded that they were heirs to the richest inheritance in the world, which comprised most of the great American city of New York. Persons who were going to participate in 2,500 millions of francs could afford to be hospitable. MLE General stayed to dinner. A list of the heirs living in or near Bordeaux was made out with the share of each in the inheritance carefully computed. Madame Lapierre's was only $50 million, but still that was almost enough to buy up Bordeaux. And they could purchase Montsert as a country place. The general spoke of a stable of automobiles by means of which the journey from Bordeaux to the farm could be accomplished in the space of an hour. That night the good man and his wife scarcely closed their eyes, and the next day, accompanied by the general, they visited Bordeaux and the neighboring towns and broke the news gently to the other heirs. There was M. Petit, the veterinary at Mormont, Tessie, the blacksmith in Bordeaux, M. Paligue and his wife, M. Roger, M. Cazenava and his son, and others. One branch of the family lived in Brazil, the Jubinfrères, and one Tessie of Saint Bézaille. These last had to be reached by post, a most annoyingly slow means of communication. Mais que voulez-vous? Those were busy days in and around Bordeaux, and the general was the center of attraction. What a splendid figure he cut in his tall silk hat and gold-headed cane. but they were all very careful to let no inkling of their good fortune leak out, for it might spoil everything, give some opportunity to the spies of the impostor Lespinasse to fabricate new chains of title or to prepare for a defense of the fortune. The little blacksmith, being addicted to white wine, was the only one who did not keep his head. But even he managed to hold his mouth sufficiently shut. A family council was held. MLE General was given full power of attorney to act for all the heirs, and each having contributed an insignificant sum toward his necessary expenses, they waved him a tremulous goodbye as he stood on the upper deck of the steamer, his silk hat in one hand and his gold-headed cane in the other. "He will get it, if anyone can," cried the blacksmith enthusiastically. "It is as good as ours already," echoed Roger. "My friends," Madame Lapierre assured them, "a general of the armies of Spain and a chevalier of the Order of Jimenez would die rather than fail in his mission. Besides," she added, her French blood asserting itself, "he is to get 19% of the inheritance." As long as the steamer remained in sight, the general waved encouragingly, his hat raised toward heaven. "Mais," says Lapierre, with another shrug as he lights his pipe, "even you would have believed him. Vraiment. He would have deceived the devil himself." Up the road the wain comes creaking back again. A crow flaps across the vineyard, laughing scornfully at good M. Lapierre, and you yourself wonder if such a thing could have been possible. On a rainy afternoon in March, 1905, there entered the writer's office in the Criminal Courts Building, New York City, a ruddy, stoutly built man, dressed in homespun garments, accompanied by an attractive and vivacious little woman, who, while unable to speak a single word of English, had no difficulty in making it obvious that she had a story to tell of the most vital importance. An interpreter was soon found and the names of the visitors disclosed. The lady, who did the talking for both of them, introduced herself as Madame Valois Redon, of Bordeaux, and her companion as M. Émile Lapierre, landowner, of Montsayre. They had come, she explained, from France to take possession of the inheritance. Tessie. She was a personal friend of Madame Lapierre, and as the Tessies had exhausted all their money in paying the expenses connected with securing the fortune, she, being a well-to-do gentlewoman, had come to their assistance, and for the last few months had been financing the enterprise on a 15% basis. If Madame Lapierre was to receive $10 million, then, to be sure, Madame Redon would have $1,500,000, but, of course, it was not for the money, but on account of friendship, that she was aiding them. I would understand that 3 years had elapsed since a certain distinguished General Pedro Suarez de Moreno had disclosed to the Lapierres the fact that Madame was the heiress to the greatest estate in America. M. Lapierre solemnly nodded confirmation as the lady proceeded. It was the one subject talked about in the Gironde and Bordeaux, that is, among those who had been fortunate enough to learn anything about it. And for 3 years the Tessies, their wives, their sons' wives, and their connections, had been waiting to receive the glad tidings that the conspirators had been put to rout and the rightful heirs reinstated. It was some time before the good lady succeeded in convincing her auditor that such a ridiculous fraud as she described had actually been perpetrated. But there was M. Lapierre and there was Madame Valerie Redon sitting in the office as living witnesses to the fact. What wonderful person could this General Moreno be, who could hypnotize a hard-headed, thrifty farmer from the Gironde and a clever little French woman from Bordeaux into believing that $500 million was waiting for them on the other side of the Atlantic? I expressed my surprise. Madame Redon shrugged her sloping shoulders. Well, perhaps it was hard for MCO to believe, but then there were the proofs, the documents, the dossier, and, most of all, there was the general himself. Oh, if MCO could see the general in his tall silk hat and gold-headed cane. I asked for the documents. Madame Redon opened her bag and produced a package of nearly 100 letters, written in a fine Spanish hand. Oh! He had been a wonderful writer, this gorgeous Count de Tinoco and Marquis de la Dehesa. She had met him herself when he had been in Bordeaux. Madame Lapierre had introduced him to her, and she had heard him talk. How beautifully he talked! The stories of his experiences as General of the armies of Spain under Don Carlos and as Brigadier General in the Philippines were as fascinating as a romance. But it was his letters which had really led her to take a personal interest in the undertaking. With a sigh, Madame Valois untied the little blue ribbon which bound up the pitiful little history. If MCO would be good enough to grant the time, she would begin at the beginning. Here was his first letter written after the general's return to America. June 25, 02. My dear M. Lapierre, we have had a terrible voyage. A horrible storm broke loose in mid-ocean, endangering all our lives. The waves, like mountains, threatened every instant to swallow us all. The spectacle was terrifying. I fell from the top of the stairs, way down into the hole, sick, hurting my right leg in the center of the tibia bone. The ship's doctor, who is nothing but a stupid fool, left me helpless almost the entire day. If ever I should have dreamt what would occur to me in this trip, not for all the gold in the world would I have embarked. But, now that I am here, I shall not retreat before any obstacle, in order to arrive at the fulfillment of my enterprise, and no matter at what cost, even at that of my life. It is necessary that I succeed. My pride demands it. Those who are in the right shall triumph, that is sure. In the meantime, will you kindly give my regards to Madame and your son, and all of your relatives, not forgetting your good old servant. Squeezing your hand cordially, I bid you adieu. Your devoted Pedro Este Moreno. Can you not see the waves, and observe him falling down the hole? Asks Madame Redon. Mais, voici un autre. July 11, 1902. M. Jean Lapierre. My dear M. Lapierre, as soon as I could walk a little I began my research for the impostors of the inheritance Tessie. Without a doubt some person who is interested in the case has already advised them of my arrival in New York, and to take the necessary precautions to lead me astray in my researches. Already I have discovered almost everything. I know even the house in which resided the deceased before his death. It is a house of 25 stories high, which resembles the Church of Saint Magdalene in Paris. Today it is the biggest bank in New York. I have visited it from top to bottom, ascending and descending in steel elevators. This is a marvelous palace. It is worth more than $5 million. The house itself has the numbers 100, 102, 104, 106, 108, 110, 112, 114, 116 and 118. In other words, it covers the ground of 10 other houses made into one. I have also visited 6 houses belonging to him, which are worth millions and are located around Central Park. As soon as the brothers Lespinasse knew that I had arrived in New York, they immediately took their departure, one for Paris to find his father, Emeric Lespinasse, the other to the city of Tuxpan, in Mexico, to visit the properties stolen from the heirs. I have come to an understanding with the Reverend Father Van Rensselaer, Father Superior of the Jesuits, and have offered him $2 million for his poor, in recompense for his aid to recover and to enter into possession of the inheritance. He takes great pains, and is my veritable guide and confidant. I have visited Central Park, also a property of the deceased. This property alone is worth more than $20 million. I have great confidence in my success. And I am almost sure to reach the goal, if you are the heirs, for here there is a mix-up by all the devils. The wound of my leg has much improved, the consequences which I feared have disappeared, and I expect soon my complete convalescence, but the devil has bestowed upon me a toothache, which makes me almost crazy with pain. I shall leave, nevertheless, to begin my campaign. Will you be kind enough to give my regards to your wife and son, and to our old friend, etc., etc. Pedro Este Moreno. May the devil bestow upon him 500 million toothaches! Exclaims Lapierre, for the first time showing any sign of animation. The other letters were read in their order, interspersed with Madame Redin's explanations of their effect upon the heirs in France. His description of the elevators of steel and of the house that covered an entire block had caused a veritable sensation. Alas! Those wonders are still wonders to them, and they still, I fancy, more than half believe in them. The letters are lying before me now. Astonishing emanations, totally ridiculous to a prosaic American, but calculated to convince and stimulate the imagination of a petit bourgeois. The general in glowing terms paints his efforts to run down the Lespinasse conspirators. Although suffering horribly from his fractured tibia, when he fell into the hole, and from other dire ills, he has not taken the slightest rest. He has been everywhere: New Orleans, Florida, to the city of Coney Island, to corner the villains, who flee in all directions. The daughter, Marie-Louise, through whom the general expects to secure a compromise, has left for New Orleans. Wonderful coincidence, he writes, they were all living quietly and I believe had no intention whatever to travel, and 2 days after my arrival in New York they all disappeared. The most suspicious of it all is that the banker, his wife and children had left for Coney Island for the summer and to spend their holidays, and certainly they disappeared without saying goodbye to their intimate friends. I have the whole history of Tessie's life and how he made his fortune. There is a family for the use of whom we must give at least $1 million, for the fortune of Tessie was not his alone. He had a companion who shared his troubles and his work. According to the will they were to inherit one from the other. The companion died, and Tessie inherited everything. I do not see the necessity of your trip to New York, that might make noise and perhaps delay my negotiations. Then follows the list of properties embraced in the inheritance. Property and personal estate of the heirs. 1. The land of Central Park ceded to the city of New York, of the value of $5 million. 2. He had at the National Bank United States Bank deposited in gold $20 to $30 million. He never withdrew anything, on the contrary, he always deposited his income. There $25 million. 3. The big house on Broadway, NOS 100 to 118, of 25 stories, today the largest bank in New York. $5 million. 4. The house on Fifth Avenue, number 765, facing Central Park, today one of the first hotels of New York. Hotel Savoy. $8 million. 5. House on Fifth Avenue, number 767, facing Central Park, today the biggest and most handsomest of American hotels, where the greatest people and Millionaires Stop Hotel Netherlands 20 million.00. 6-2 Coal mines at Focustung in Texas 9 million.00. 7A petroleum mine in Pennsylvania. Mexican frontier, 6 million.00. 8 shares of silver mine at Tuxpan. Mexico 10 million.00. 9 The house at Tuxpan and its grounds. Mexico 15,000.00. 10 The pleasure home and grounds in Florida, New Orleans, in the city of Coney Island 500,000.00. 11 The house which covers all the square plaza, no number because it is all alone. It is an immense palace with a park and gardens, and waters forming cascades and labyrinths. Facing Central Park 12 million.00. 12 The block of houses on 5th and 6th Avenues, facing on this same Central Park, which, as all these grounds belong to him, he had put up. They are 100 houses, that is called here a block 30 million.00. 13 He is the owner of 2 railroads and owns shares of others in Pennsylvania and Canada 40 million.00. 14 A line of steam and sailboats Atlantic, the Pennsylvania and the Tennessee, and other names 100 million.00. 15 A dock and a quay of 800 meters on the Brooklyn River 4. His ships 130 million.00. 16 Several values and debts owed him and which at his death had not been collected $40,000. 390,555,000, which is in francs 1,952,775,000, plus 5% or 976,388. Total in francs 1,953,751,388. Do you blame us? Asks Madame Valois, as I listen as politely as possible to this Arabian Nights dream of riches. The letters continue. The general is surrounded by enemies, of which the worst are French, and he is forced continually to change his residence in order to escape their machinations. But all this takes money. How can he go to Tuxpan or to the city of Coney Island? You cannot know nor imagine the expense which I have had to discover that which I have discovered. I cannot live here like a miser, for the part I represent demands much of me. Every moment I change my residence, and that costs money. He adds a little touch of detail. I must always be dressed properly, and laundry is very dear here. A shirt costs 25 cents to wash, and there are other necessary expenses. You have forgotten to tell me if you have received the album of views of New York in which I have indicated the properties of the deceased. I squeeze your hand. Yes, and our purses too, adds Madame Valois. Would Monsieur care to see the album of the Tennessee properties? Yes. Monsieur Lapierre, kindly show the gentleman. Lapierre unbuttons his homespun coat and produces a cheap paper-covered blank book in which are pasted small photographs and woodcuts of various well-known New York buildings. It is hard not to smile. Monsieur will see, continues Madame Valois, that the dream had something substantial about it. When we saw these pictures in Bordeaux we were on the point of giving up in despair, but the pictures convinced us that it was all true. Moreover, just at that time the general intimated that unless he had more money, he might yield to the efforts of the Lespinasse family to buy him off. Madame Valois points vindictively to a certain paragraph in one of the letters. Of course they are convinced that I am not for sale, not for anything. To my regret, my very great regret, I shall be forced to capitulate if you do not come to my aid, and that quickly, for I repeat to you that my funds are all gone. And here is his bill, continues Madame Valois, producing a folded document. Composed of countless sheets of very thin paper, bound together at the edges by strips of heavier material. This, when unfolded, stretches entirely across the room and is seen to be composed of hundreds of typewritten items, of which the following may serve as illustrations. Expenses in New York. July 12, train to New Orleans. $25.50. 16, train to Florida. $2.50. Dinner on train. $2. 17, hotel in Florida. $2. 18, trip to Coney Island. $.50. 19, return to Florida. $.50. 21, return from Florida to New Orleans. $2.50. Laundry. $1.15. December 3rd, return to New York. $6.50. 24, train to Veracruz. $57.50. January 4th, trip to Tucson. $2.50. 5, return to Veracruz. $2.50. 6, sudden night trip to Halifax, Nova Scotia, via Buffalo and Niagara Falls. $50.50. 18, laundry for 3 months. $5. Etc., etc. Extraordinary expenses. To Agent Pushit John, a meerschaum and amber. Cigar holder and pipe. $7. Tobacco jar of shell and silver. $4. To Indian Peter Southgo, a watch, a suit, and a pair of shoes. $16.50. To my general agent of confidential reports. For his daughter, a gold ring and a feather fan. $7. A necktie for himself and scarf pin in gold and with stone for the necktie. $8.60. To the letter carrier to bring me my correspondence and not give it to any one else when I should change address. $4. Invitation to the consul and his 2 agents in Washington hotel. $12. Several invitations to cafes and saloons. To the police agents. $2. Invitations to old employees of Jean Tessie, to tear from them the declarations. $1.50. Barber expenses. $11.50. Tobacco and matches, July to December. 3 packages each week, 10 cents each. $7.80. Changing hotels to lead astray the agents of the impostors. $9.50. Etc., etc. To obtain a colossal fortune as yours will be, it is necessary to spend money unstintingly and to have lots of patience. Court proceedings will be useless, as trickery and lies are necessary to get the best of the scoundrels. It is necessary also to be a scoundrel, that he might well say, interpolets Lapierre. He succeed, say sure. I rapidly glanced over the remaining letters. The general seems always to be upon the verge of compelling a compromise. I have already prepared my net, and the meshes are tightly drawn so that the fish will not be able to escape. 4. An office like this one needs money to go quickly from one place to another, prosecute the usurpers, not allow them an instant's rest. If they go to some city, run after them at once, tire them with my presence and constantly harass them, and by this means compel them to hasten a compromise. The general is meeting with superhuman obstacles. In addition to his enemies, he suffers all sorts of terrible bodily afflictions. Whenever the remittances from the Lapierres do not arrive, the difficulties and diseases increase. At last, however, After an interval of 2 years, things took a turn for the better. A confidential representative of the conspirators, one Mr. Benedict Smith, arrived to make a bona fide offer of $150 million in settlement of the case. The general writes at great length as to exactly in what proportion the money should be divided among the heirs. The thing is so near a culmination that he is greatly exercised over his shabby appearance. I am without a son and too badly dressed to go before the banker in the very likely case of his arrival here. Send me my baggage at once with the first steamer, and mark each piece fragile. This is all. My regards to Madame Lapierre and your son. I am cordially yours, squeezing your hand. Pedro Este Moreno. But the Lapierres and Tessis, while not for an instant distrusting the honesty of the general, had become extremely weary of sending him money. Each heir felt that he had contributed enough toward the general's expenses and invitations. Even the 150 millions within easy reach did not prompt immediate response. About the same time an extraordinary messenger arrived at the Lapierre farm, purporting to come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and instructing Lapierre to repair immediately to Paris. The messenger explained that the presence of Lapierre was desired at the ministry in connection with some investigation then in progress into the affairs of one Jean Tessie. Then the messenger departed as mysteriously as he had arrived. Good M. Lapierre was highly excited. Here was indubitable evidence of the truth of the general's assertions. But, just as the latter had intended, perhaps, the worthy farmer jumped to the conclusion that probably the messenger from Paris had been sent by the conspirators. At the last moment, wrote Lapierre to Moreno, I received from Paris a letter commanding me to go to the ministry, and at the same time a telegram recommending that I leave at once. I shall write you from Paris all that I learn to your interest. If this letter should not reach you sealed in red wax, with small indentations made with a sewing thimble and my initials, which I always sign, it is that our correspondence is seized and read. Events followed in rapid succession. Lapierre, the Tessis, including the little blacksmith, became almost hysterical with excitement. A gentleman, by name Mr. Francis Dellis, called upon Lapierre and offered him $25 million spot cash for his wife's share in the Tessie inheritance. This person also claimed that he had a power of attorney from all the other heirs, with the exception of Petit and Roger, and asserted that he was on the point of embarking for New York in their interest. He urged Lapierre to substitute him for Moreno. But Lapierre, now convinced that everything was as the general had claimed it to be, indignantly rejected any such proposition aimed at his old friend, and sent Mr. Francis Dellis packing about his business. This is what my answer has been to him, sir. We have already an agent with whom we can only have cause to be satisfied, so that your services are not acceptable or needed. He left me most dissatisfied and scolding. The sending of this confederate on the part of the wily general had precisely the effect hoped for. Lapierre and his friends were now convinced that the inheritance Tessie was a reality, and that powerful personages were not only exerting their influence to prevent the rightful heirs from obtaining their property, but had also in some way secured the cooperation of government officials. It was agreed, on all hands, that the worthy landowner, accompanied by Madame Redon, had better proceed at once to the scene of operations and unite with the general in their common purpose. Once on the ground, Lapierre could assume direction of his own campaign. Lapierre and Madame Redon accordingly sailed for America and arrived in New York on the 4th of December, 1904, where they were met on the dock by the general, who, freshly barbered, and with a rose in his buttonhole, invited them, as soon as they had recovered from the fatigue of landing, to make a personal inspection of their properties. These heirs to hundreds of millions of dollars were conducted by the Marquis de la Dehesa and Count de Tinoco to the Battery, where he gallantly seated them in an electric surface car, and proceeded to show them the inheritance. He pointed out successively number 100 Broadway, the Flatiron Building, the Fifth Avenue Hotel and the Holland House, the Waldorf Astoria, the Vanderbilt Mansion at 57th Street and 5th Avenue, the Hotel Savoy and the Hotel Netherland, incidentally taking a cross-town trip to the ferry station at East 23rd Street, and to Bellevue Hospital. A public omnibus conveyed them around Central Park, also their own. And, in spite of the cold weather, the General insisted on showing them the Tessie mansion and estate at Fort George, visible from the Washington Bridge, a beautiful property in the center of a wood. Returning, he took them to the Museum of Natural History and to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which contained Tessie's collections. Having thus given them a bird's-eye view of the promised land, the General escorted them to his apartments and allowed them to see the Ark of the Covenant, in the shape of a somewhat dilapidated leather trunk, which contained a paper alleged to be the will of Jean Tessie, made in Bellevue Hospital, one of his possessions, and unlawfully seized by the Lespinasse family. It was only, Moreno alleged, through the powerful influence of the Jesuits that he had been able to secure and keep a copy of this will. Although the Marquis de la Dehesa must have known that his days were numbered, he was as gay and as entertaining as ever. Then, suddenly, the scales began to fall from Madame Redon's eyes. The promised meeting with Marie Louise Lespinasse and her mysterious representative, Mr. Benedict Smith, was constantly adjourned. The police agents, whom it had been so necessary to entertain and invite to saloons and cafes, were strangely absent, and so were the councillors, Jesuit fathers, bankers, and others who had crowded the General's antechambers. A slatternly Hibernian woman appeared, claiming the hero as her husband. His landlady caused him to be evicted from her premises, and his trunk, containing the famous dossier, was thrown into the street, where it lay until the General himself, placing it upon his princely shoulders, bore it to a 15-cent lodging house. "And now, Monsieur," said little Madame Redon, raising her hands and clasping them entreatingly before her, "we have come to seek vengeance upon this miserable, this villain Monsieur. He has taken our money and made fools of us. Surely you will give us justice." "Yes," echoed Lapierre stubbornly, "and the money was my own money, which I had made from the products of my farming." A month later, Don Pedro Suarez de Moreno, Count de Tinoco, Marquis de la Dehesa, and Brigadier General of the Royal Armies of the Philippines and of Spain, sat at the bar of the General Sessions, twirling his mustache and uttering loud snorts of contempt, while Lapierre and Madame Redon told their story to an almost incredulous yet sympathetic jury. But the real trial began only when he arose to take the witness chair in his own behalf. Apparently racked with pain, and laboring under the most frightful physical infirmities, the General, through an interpreter, introduced himself to the jury by all his titles, asserting that he had inherited his patents of nobility from the Prince of Arras, from whom he was descended, and that he was in very truth General-in-Chief of the armies of the King of Spain, General Secretary of War, and Custodian of the Royal Seal. He admitted telling the Lapierres that they were the heirs of $500 million, but he had himself honestly believed it. When he and the rest of them had discovered their common error, they had turned upon him and were now hounding him out of revenge. The courtly General was as distingué as ever as he addressed the hard headed jury of tradesmen before him. As what canile he must have regarded them. What a position for the Count de Tinoco. Then two officers entered the courtroom bearing the famous trunk of the general. Between them, the top tray proved to contain thousands of railroad tickets. The prosecutor requested the defendant to explain their possession. "Ah!" exclaimed Moreno, twirling his mustaches, "when I was general under my King Don Carlos, in the 7 Years' War of '75 and also in Catalonia in '80. I issued these tickets to wounded soldiers for their return home. At the boundaries the Spanish tickets were exchanged for French tickets." He looked as if he really meant it. Then the prosecutor called his attention to the fact that most of them bore the date of 1891 and were printed in French, not in Spanish. The prisoner seemed greatly surprised and muttered under his breath vaguely about plots and conspiracies. Then he suddenly remembered that the tickets were a collection, made by his little son. Beneath the tickets were found sheaves of blank orders of nobility and blank commissions in the army of Spain, bearing what appeared to be the royal seal. These the general asserted that he had the right to confer, by proxy, for his King Don Carlos. Hundreds of other documents bearing various arms and crests lay interspersed among them. The prisoner drew himself up magnificently. "I was the General Secretary of War of my king," said he. "When I had to give orders to the generals under me, of whom I was the chief, I had the right to put thereon the royal imprint of Don Carlos. I was given all the papers incident to the granting of orders and grades in the army, and I had the seal of the king, the seal of the royal king. But, unfortunately for the prisoner, the seals upon the papers turned out to be the legitimate arms of Spain and not those of Don Carlos, and as a finale he ingenuously identified the seal of the mayor of Madrid as that of his royal king. Next came a selection of letters of nobility, sealed and signed in the name of Pope Leo XIII. These, he asserted, must have been placed there by his enemies. I am a soldier and a general of honor, and I never did any such trafficking," he cried grandly, when charged with selling bogus patents of nobility. He explained some of his correspondence with the Lapierres and his famous bill for $12,000 by saying that when he found out that the inheritance Tessie did not exist, he had conceived the idea of making a novel of the story, a fantastic history to be published in 4 languages simultaneously, and asserted solemnly that he had intended printing the whole 16 feet of bill as part of the romance. Then, to the undisguised horror of the unfortunate general, at a summons from the prosecutor, an elderly French woman arose in the audience and came to the bar. The general turned first pale, then purple. He hotly denied that he had married this lady in France 23 years ago. Name of a name. He had known her. Yes, certainly. But she was no wife of his, she had been only his servant. The other lady, the Hibernian, was his only wife. But the chickens had begun to come home to roost. The pointed mustaches drooped with an unmistakable look of dejection, and as he marched back to his seat, his shoulders no longer had the air of military distinction that one would expect in a general of a royal king. His head sank on his chest as his deserted wife took the stand against him, the wife whom he had imagined he would never see again. Anyone could have seen that Elizabeth de Moreno was a good woman. Her father's name, she said, was Nichod, and she had first met the prisoner 23 years ago in the village of Dock, in the department of the Tarn, where, in 1883, he had been convicted and sentenced for stealing bed linen from the hotel Kassam. She had remained faithful to him in spite of his disgrace, and had visited him daily in prison, bringing him milk and tobacco. On his liberation she had married him and they had gone to live in Bordeaux. For years they had lived in comfort, and she had borne him 8 children. He had never been to any war, and was neither a general nor, so far as she had known, a friend of Don Carlos. She had supposed that her husband held some position in connection with the inspection of railroads, but, in 1902, it had come out that he was in the business of selling counterfeit railroad tickets, and had employed a printer named Paul Cassignol to print great numbers of third-class tickets for the purpose of selling them to ignorant soldiers and artisans. Moreno had fled to America. She had then discovered that he had also made a practice of checking worthless baggage, stealing it himself and then presenting claims therefor against the railroad companies. She had been left without a sou, and the rascal had taken everything. She had a way with him, including even the locket containing the hair of her children. By the time she had finished her story, Moreno's courage had deserted him. The jury without hesitation returned a verdict of guilty, and the judge then and there sentenced the prisoner to a term at hard labor in state's prison. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Mais oui, grunts Lapierre, as the crow, with a final caw of contempt, alights in a poplar farther down the road. I don't blame the bird for laughing at me. But, after all, there is nothing to be ashamed of. Is one to be blamed that one is fooled? Hein. We are all made fools of once and again, and, as I said before, he would have deceived the devil himself. But perhaps things are better as they are. Money is the root of all evil. If I had an automobile I should probably be thrown out and have my neck broken. But if MCO intends to take the next train for Bordeaux, it is as well that he should be starting. Story 3. The Lost Stradivarius. In the year 1885, Jean Bott, a native of Hesse Kassel, Germany, emigrated with his wife Matilda to this country, bringing with him a celebrated violin known as the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius, which he had purchased in 1873 for about 3,000 thalers, a sum representing practically the savings of a lifetime. Bott had been leader of a small orchestra in Saxe-Meiningen as early as 1860, and was well advanced in years before he determined to seek his fortune in America. His wife was an elderly woman and they had no offspring. This violin, my husband and myself made up the family. I loved it like a child, she testified at the trial. So also did Bott, the old musician, love his instrument, and no hand but his own was ever permitted to lift it from its case or dust its darkly glowing surface. Whatever may have been its owner's genius, he prospered little in the New World. And, although he labored conscientiously at his profession, the year 1894 found him still giving lessons upon the violin to only half a dozen pupils, and living in 2 rooms at 355 West 31st Street. But Bott, having the soul of a true musician, cared but little for money and was happy enough so long as he could smoke his old meerschaum pipe and draw the bow across the cherished violin held lovingly to his cheek. Then hard times came a-knocking at the door. The meager account in the savings bank grew smaller and smaller. The landlord, the doctor and the grocer had to be paid. One night Bott laid down his pipe and, taking his wife's wrinkled hand in his, said gently, "Matilda, there is nothing else, we must sell our violin." "Even so," she answered, turning away her face that her husband might not see the tears. "As God wills." The next day the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was offered for sale by Victor S. Flechter, a friend of Bott's, who was a dealer in musical instruments at 23 Union Square. It so happened that Niccolini, the husband of Adelina Patti, was ambitious to own a genuine Stradivarius, and had been looking for one for a long time, and, although he was but an indifferent player, he had, in default of skill to perform, the money to buy. The matter was easily adjusted by Flechter, and Niccolini drew his check for the sum specified, which, properly certified, was tendered to Bott. But Bott had never seen a certified check and was unaccustomed to the ways of business. If I part with my violin, I must have real money, money that I can feel, money that I can count. It was that kind of money that I paid for my violin, said he doggedly. Niccolini, in a rage, believing himself insulted, tore the check to bits and declared the transaction at an end. Now the price agreed upon for the violin had been $4,500, of which Flechter was to receive $500 as his commission, and when, through old Professor Bott's stubbornness, the sale fell through, the dealer was naturally very angry. Out of this incident grew the case against Flechter. The old musician was accustomed to leave his treasured instrument in the lowest drawer of his bureau at the boarding house. He always removed it before his pupils arrived and never put it back until their departure, thus ensuring the secrecy of its hiding place, and only his wife, his sister-in-law, Mollenhauer, a friend, and Cloten, a prospective purchaser, knew where it lay. On the morning of March 31, 1894, not long after the Niccolini incident, Bott gave a single lesson to a pupil at the boarding house, and after his midday meal, set out with his wife for Hoboken to visit a friend. The violin was left in its customary place. It was dark when they returned, and after throwing off his coat and lighting the gas, the old man hastened to make sure that his precious violin was safe. When he pulled out the drawer, it was empty. The Stradivarius was gone, with its leather case, its two bows and its wooden box. Half distracted, the musician and his wife searched everywhere in the room, in closets, under beds, even behind the curtains, before they could bring themselves to admit that the violin had in fact disappeared. Frantically Bott called for Ellen, the servant girl. Yes, there had been a caller, a young man with dark hair and a small, dark mustache, at about 5 o'clock. He had waited about half an hour, and then had said that he guessed he would go. She had not noticed that he took anything away with him. In his despair, the old man turned to his old friend Flechter, and the next day the dealer came to express his sympathy. He urged Bott to notify the police of the theft, but the old man was prostrate with grief. And it was the wife who, with Ellen Clancy, finally accompanied Flechter to police headquarters. The police had no idea who had taken the old fellow's fiddle, and did not particularly care anyway. Later they cared a good deal. Bott now began an endless and almost hopeless search for his beloved instrument, visiting every place where violins were sold, every pawn shop and second-hand store again and again, until the proprietors began to think the old man must be crazy. Sometimes Flechter went with him. Once, the two traveled all the way over to New Jersey, but the scent proved to be a false one. Bott grew thinner and older week by week, almost day by day. When the professor did not feel equal to going outdoors, Mrs. Bott went for him, and on these occasions often called at Flechter's store to report progress, ask his advice and secure his encouragement. One day during one of these visits in the July following the loss of the violin, Flechter handed Mrs. Bott a sheet of paper, saying, "I have written something down here. If you have that printed and put a reward to it, you will get your violin back." The wording, partly printed and partly written in script, ran as follows: "Violin lost. $500 reward. No questions asked for return of instrument taken from residence of Jean Bott. March 31st, 1894, 355 West 31st Street. Absolute safety and secrecy guaranteed. Victor S. Flechter, number 21 Union Square, violin maker and dealer. Mrs. Bott thanked him and took the notice away with her, but its publication had no result. The old professor began to fail. He no longer had an instrument upon which to teach his pupils, and those he could avail himself of seemed harsh and discordant. He had no appetite, and even found no solace in his pipe. Almost penniless, they were forced to give up their lodgings and move to Hoboken. Mrs. Bott still kept up the search, but the professor could no longer tramp the streets looking for his violin. He sat silent in his room, slowly, surely, dying of a broken heart. In course of time someone advised Mrs. Bott to lay her case before the district attorney, and accordingly, during the summer, she visited the criminal courts building and told her story to Colonel Allen, one of the assistants, who became greatly interested. The overwrought old woman had begun to suspect everybody, and even to accuse her husband's friend, Flechter, of a lack of any real interest. She thought he ought to be able to find the violin if he really made the effort. Allen began to take notice. The sleuth in him pricked up its ears. Why, sure. Certainly, Flechter was the one man who knew what Bott's violin was really worth, the one man who could sell it to advantage, and he had been done out of $500 by the old musician's stupidity. Allen thought he'd take a look into the thing. Now, there lived in the same boarding house with Allen a friend of his named Harry P. Durden, and to Durden Allen recounted the story of the lost violin and voiced his suspicions of Flechter. Durden entered enthusiastically into the case, volunteering to play the part of an amateur detective. Accordingly, Durden, accompanied by a central office man named Baird, visited Flechter's place of business, and the two represented themselves as connoisseurs in violins and anxious to procure a genuine Strad for a certain Mr. Wright in St. Paul. Flechter expressed entire confidence in his ability to procure one, and did almost succeed in purchasing for them the so-called Jupiter Strad. All this took time, and at last, on April 28, 1895, poor old Bott died in his boarding house in Hoboken. After the funeral, the widow settled up her affairs, changing her boarding place temporarily, and, having no ties in this country, determined to return to end her days in the fatherland. On May 21 she wrote to Flechter, who had lost all track of her, that her husband had died, that she had moved to 306 River Street, Hoboken, and that she thought seriously of going back to Germany. 2 days later Flechter wrote the following letter to the central office man, who had given his name as Southan, an employee of the alleged Mr. Wright. Mr. Southan, care of H.P. Durden. Dear Sir, write to inform you that I have a genuine Strad to offer you and would like to see you at your earliest convenience. Very respectfully yours, Victor S. Flechter. When Allen saw this letter, it seemed to him absolutely to confirm his suspicions. Now that the only person in the world who had been authoritatively able to identify the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was dead, Flechter was offering one for sale. Then occurred the strangest thing of all. On May 28, 5 days after Flechter's letter to Southan, Mrs. Bott received the following extraordinary epistle. Like the notice given her by Flechter in his office, it was partly written in printed capitals, and partly in script. May 28, 1895. To Mrs. Bott, 306 River Street, Hoboken, N.J. Dear Madam, I wish to inform you that the violin taken from your house some time ago will be returned if you are willing to abide by agreements that will be made between you and I later on. It was my intention first to dispose of it, but on account of its great value and the danger it would place me in by offering for sale, being a violin maker and dealer and not being able to sell with safety for such a large sum of money, I concluded to wait. I have now thought the matter over and come to the conclusion that a little money is better than none, and if you are anxious for the return of the violin and willing to pay a sum of money, small compared with the value of the violin, I think we can make a deal. You can put a personal in the New York Sun saying I am willing to give a sum of money for the return of the violin. No questions asked. Mrs. J. Bott. When I see your personal in the Sun, I will let you know how the exchange can be made. Cave Dweller. This letter appeared to be written in a somewhat similar hand to that which penned the offer of the reward, which, according to Mrs. Bott, was Flechter's. By this time the widow and Allen were in close communication. The Cave Dweller letter, could it be shown to be in Flechter's penmanship, seemed to fix the crime on the violin dealer. Flechter's store is 2 flights up and looks out into Union Square. Before the window hangs a large gilded fiddle and the walls are decorated with pictures of famous musicians. In the rear is a safe where the more valuable instruments are kept. In the front sits Flechter himself, a stoutish man of middle height, with white hair and mustache. But on June 23, 1895, Flechter was out when Durden and Baird called, and only his clerk and office boy were on hand. Durden wished, he said, to see the genuine Strad, about which Mr. Flechter had written him. The boy went to the safe and brought back a violin in a red silk bag. Inside was inscribed, Antonius Stradivarius Cremonis Facit Anno Domini 1725. The figures 17 were printed and the 25 written in ink. Durden examined it for some 15 minutes and noted certain markings upon it. On June 26 they called again, found Flechter in and asked to see the violin. This time the dealer looked at himself from the safe, and, at their request, carried it to 22 Gramercy Park, where Durden said he desired some experts to pass upon its genuineness. On the way over, Flechter guaranteed it to be a genuine Strad, and said it belonged to a retired merchant named Rossman, who would expect to get $4,000 for it. He himself would want $500, and Durden should have $500, so that they must not take less than $5,000. Once at Allen's boarding house, Flechter played upon the violin for Durden and the supposed Southan, and then the former asked to be allowed to take the instrument to a rear room and show it to a friend. Here Mrs. Bott, positively, identified the violin as that of her husband, clasping it to her bosom like a long-lost child. This was enough for Durden, who gave the instrument back to Flechter and caused his arrest as he was passing out of the front gate. The insulted dealer stormed and raged, but the car of Juggernaut had started upon its course, and that night Flechter was lodged in the city prison. Next morning he was brought before Magistrate Flammer in the Jefferson Market Police Court, and the violin was taken out of its case, which the police had sealed. At this, the first hearing in this extraordinary case, Mrs. Bott, of course, identified the violin positively as the Duke of Cambridge, and several other persons testified that, in substance, it was Bott's celebrated violin. But for the defendant, a number of violin makers swore that it was not the Bott violin at all, and more, that it was not even a Stradivarius. One of them, John J. Eller, to whom it will be necessary to revert later, made oath that the violin was his, stolen from him and brought to Flechter by the thief. On this testimony the magistrate naturally decided that the Identity of the instrument had not been established and ordered that Flechter be discharged and the violin returned to him. Ordinarily that would have been the end of the case, but Allen had his own private views as to the guilt of the dealer, and on August 28 the grand jury filed an indictment against Flechter accusing him of feloniously receiving stolen property, the violin knowing it to have been stolen. Great was Flechter's anger and chagrin, but he promptly gave bail and employed the ablest counsel he could afford. Now began the second act of this tragedy of errors. The case was called for trial. With the people's interests in the hands of James W. Osborne, just advancing into the limelight as a resourceful and relentless prosecutor. I say the people's case. But perhaps Allen's case would be a more fitting title. For the defense, Arthur W. Palmer held the fort, directing his fire upon Osborne and losing no advantage inadvertently given him. The noise of the conflict filled the courthouse and drowned the uproar on Broadway. Nightly and each morning the daily press gave columns to the proceedings. Every time the judge coughed, the important fact was given due prominence, and every jibe of counsel carried behind it its insignia of recognition. Laughter. It was one of those first great battles in which the professional value of compressed air as an explosive force and small pica type as projectiles was demonstrated. It was a combat of wind and leaden endurance contest during which the jury slept fitfully for 3 long weeks. 2 things, the prosecution claimed, proved Flechter's guilt. First, the fact that the violin found in his possession was the Duke of Cambridge. Second, that the cave dweller letter was in the same handwriting as Flechter's notice of reward. Of course, the latter proposition carried with it the necessity of proving in the first place that the notice itself was in Flechter's penmanship. Flechter, through his counsel, said it wasn't, and that he had never told Mrs. Bott that it was. He claimed that his brother-in-law, John D. Abraham, had written it. Mrs. Bott, he alleged, was an old lady and was mistaken in her testimony when she swore that he had said, "I have written down something." He had not said so. Mr. Abraham corroborated him. He had written it himself sitting in an armchair, all but the words 355 West 31st Street, which had been put in by a certain M.R. Jopling who had been present. Mr. Jopling swore that that was so, too. But, on cross-examination, it developed that Mr. Abraham had been practicing making copies of the notice at the suggestion of the lawyer for the defense, and, when Mr. Jopling took the stand, he was called upon to explain an affidavit made by him for Assistant District Attorney Allen, in which he affirmed that he did not know who wrote the words 355 West 31st Street. His explanation did not explain, and, anyhow, there did not seem to be any particular reason why Abraham and Jopling should have written Flechter's notice for him. Besides, even if Flechter did not write it and Abraham did, it would still remain almost as bad for Flechter if it was shown that cave dweller was his own brother-in-law. But Mrs. Bott was a woman who appealed strongly to a jury's sympathies, and she was clear that Flechter had said that he had written the notice. Moreover, she recalled that the date had first been written May and that Flechter had erased it and inserted March in its place. A microscopic examination revealed the fact that such an erasure had been made. When the smoke cleared, the credibility of the defense appeared badly damaged. But the precise point was of little importance. After all, the great question was the identity of cave dweller. On this point, a number of witnesses testified from a general knowledge of Flechter's handwriting that the cave dweller letter was his, and 3 well-known handwriting experts, Dr. Percy Fraser, Mr. Daniel T. Ames and Mr. David Carvalho, swore that, in their opinion, the same hand had written it that had penned the notice. It is not unlikely that Flechter's fear of a conviction led him to invite testimony in his behalf which would not bear the test of careful scrutiny. Many an innocent man has paid the penalty for uncommitted crime because he has sought to bolster up his defense with doubtful evidence without the incubus of which he would have been acquitted. Naturally, the chief point against Flechter, if it could be established, was his actual possession of the Bott Stradivarius when he was arrested. Upon this proposition Mrs. Bott was absolutely positive beyond the possibility of error. So were 8 other witnesses for the prosecution. Then the defense produced a violin alleged to be the same one exhibited in the police court and brought by Flechter to Durden's house, and asked Mrs. Bott and her witnesses what they thought of it. Mrs. Bott could not identify it, but she swore no less positively that it was an entirely different violin from the one which she had seen before the magistrate. Then Osborne hurled his bomb over his enemy's parapet and cried loudly that a monstrous wicked fraud had been perpetrated to thwart justice, that the defense had faked another violin and were now trying to foist the bogus thing in evidence to deceive the court. 10 witnesses for the prosecution now swore that the violin so produced was not the one which Flechter had tried to sell Durden. Of course it would have been comparatively easy to fake a violin, just as Osborne claimed, and the case shed some light upon the possibilities of the old violin industry. The star witness for the prosecution to prove that the instrument produced in the police court was the Bott violin was August M. Gemunder, and his testimony upon the trial before Recorder Goff is worthy of careful examination, since the jury considered it of great importance in reaching a verdict, even requesting that it should be reread to them some hours after retiring to deliberate. Gemunder testified, in substance, that he belonged to a family which had been making violins for 3 generations and had himself been making them for 20 years, that he was familiar with Bott's Stradivarius, having seen it 3 times, and that he firmly believed a large part of the violin produced before the magistrate was the missing Bott, certainly the back and scroll. Moreover, he was able to describe the markings of the Bott violin even to the label inside it. It should be mentioned, however, that in the magistrate's court he had been called only to describe the Bott violin and not to identify the one produced as the Bott itself. He further swore that the violin now offered by the defense on the trial was not the one in evidence before the magistrate, but was one which he had sold some years before to one Charles Palm. The defense, on the other hand, called among its witnesses John P. Frederick, a violin maker, who testified that he was familiar with the Bott Strad and had seen it in 1873 at Bott's house, Grenescher Castle, in Germany, that he had repaired it in this country in 1885, that the instrument in court was not a Strad, nor even a good imitation of one, and, of course, was not the Duke of Cambridge, but that it was the identical instrument produced before the magistrate, and one which he recognized as having been sent him for repair by Charles Palm in 1885. Thus both sides agreed that the fiddle now offered in evidence was a bogus Strad, once belonging to a man named Palm, the only element of conflict being as to whether or not the violin which Flechter had offered for sale was the Palm instrument, or, in fact, Bott's famous Duke of Cambridge. All this technical testimony about violins and violin structure naturally bored the jury almost to extinction, and even the bitter personal encounters of counsel did not serve to relieve the dreariness of the trial. One oasis of humor in this desert of dry evidence gave them passing refreshment, when a picturesque witness for the defense, an instrument maker named Franz Bruckner, from South Germany, having been asked if the violin shown him was a Strad, replied, with a grunt of Disgust, ach Himmel, nein. Being then invited to describe all the characteristics of genuine Stradivarius workmanship, he tore his hair and, with an expression of utter hopelessness upon his wrinkled face, exclaimed despairingly to the interpreter, "Doctor, if I gave you lessons in this every day for 3 weeks you would know no more than you do now." An answer which was probably true, and equally so, of the jury who were shouldered with the almost impossible task of determining from this mass of conflicting opinion just where the truth really lay. The chief witness for the defense was John J. Eller, who testified that he had been a musician for 30 years and a collector of violins, that the violin in court was the same one produced before the magistrate, and was not Bott's, but his own, that he had first seen it in the possession of Charles Palm in 1886 in his house in 8th Street and St. Mark's Place, New York City, had borrowed it from Palm and played on it for 2 months in Seabright, and had finally purchased it from Palm in 1891, and continued to play in concerts upon it, until, having been loaned by him to a music teacher named Perotti, in 23rd Street, it was stolen by the latter and sold to Flechter. It appeared that Eller had at once brought suit against Flechter for the possession of the instrument, which suit, he asserted, he was still pressing in the courts, and he now declared that the violin was in exactly the same condition in every respect as when produced in the police court, although it had been changed in some respects since it had been stolen. It had originally been made of baked wood by one Dedier Nicholas, an instrument maker of the first half of the 19th century, and stamped with the maker's name, but this inscription was now covered by a Stradivarius label. Eller scornfully pointed out that no Strad had ever been made of baked wood, and showed the jury certain pegs used by no other maker than Nicholas, and certain marks worn upon the instrument by his, the witness, own playing. He also exhibited the check with which he had paid for it. In support of this evidence Charles Palm himself was called by the defense and identified the violin as one which he had bought some 12 years before for $15 or $20 and later sold to Eller. Upon the question of the identity of the instrument then lying before the jury, this evidence was conclusive, but, of course, it did not satisfy the jury as to whether Flechter had tried to sell the Palm violin or Bott's violin to Durden. Unfortunately, Eller's evidence threw aside light on the defense without which the trial might well have resulted in an acquittal. Eller had sworn that he was still vigorously endeavoring to get the Palm violin back from Flechter, as contradicting him in this respect, and as tending to show that the suit had not only been compromised but that he and Flechter were engaged in trying to put off the Palm violin as a genuine Stradivarius and share the profit of the fraud. The prosecution introduced the following letter from the witness to his lawyer. Clifton House, Chicago, Illinois. March 23, 1896. Dear Counselor, received your letter just now. I have been expecting Mr. Flechter's lawyer would settle with you. He got $900 for the violin and Mr. Meyer arranged with myself for the half, $450, which he proposed himself and have been expecting a settlement on their part long ago. I have assisted Mr. Palmer, his able lawyer, with the best of my ability, and have covered Mr. Flechter's shortcomings of faking the violin to a Strad. Yours most sincerely, John Eller. Metropolitan Opera Co., Chicago, Ill. From this letter it was fairly inferable that although the defendant might be innocent of the precise crime with which he was charged, he was, nevertheless, upon his own evidence, guilty of having faked a cheap Nicholas violin into a Strad, and of having offered it for sale for the exorbitant price of $5,000. This luckless piece of evidence undoubtedly influenced the jury to convict him. It will be recalled that 10 witnesses for the prosecution had sworn that the violin offered in evidence at the trial was not the one produced in the police court, as against the defendants 5 who asserted that it was. The testimony was all highly technical and confusing, and the jury probably relied more upon their general impressions of the credibility of the witnesses than upon anything else. It is likely that most of the testimony, on both sides, in regard to the identity of the violin was honestly given, for the question was one upon which a genuine divergence of opinion was easily possible. Eller's letter from Chicago so affected the jury that they disregarded his testimony and reverted to that of August Gemunder, to whose evidence attention has already been called, and who swore that it was the Duke of Cambridge, which Flechter had tried to sell to Durden. Alas for the fallibility of even the most honest of witnesses. The case was ably argued by both sides, and every phase of this curious tangle of evidence given its due consideration. The defense very properly laid stress upon the fact that it would have been a ridiculous performance for Flechter to write the cave dweller letter and state therein that he was a violin dealer or maker, thus pointing, unmistakably, to himself, and to further state that for one in his position to dispose of it would be difficult and dangerous. The only explanation for the cave dweller letter which they could offer, however, was that some one interested in procuring Flechter's downfall had caused it to be sent for that purpose. This might either be a business rival or someone connected with the prosecution. While Palmer was summing up for the defense, he noticed Assistant District Attorney Allen smiling and dramatically turning upon him. He shouted, "This is no laughing matter, Colonel Allen. It is a very serious matter whether this man is to be allowed tonight to go home and kiss his little ones, or whether he is to be cast into jail because you used your brains to concoct a theory against him." Another consideration, which seemed deserving of weight, was that if Flechter did steal the Duke of Cambridge, it would have been a piece of incredible folly and carelessness upon his part to leave it in such an exposed place as the safe of his store, where it could be found by the police or shown by the officeboy to anyone who called. Yet the positive identification of August Gemunder and the fatal disclosures of Eller, coupled with the vehement insistence of the prosecution, led the jury to resolve what doubt they had in the case against the prisoner, and, after deliberating 8 or 10 hours and being out all night, they returned a verdict of guilty. Flechter broke down and declared bitterly that he was the victim of a conspiracy upon the part of his enemies, assisted by a too credulous prosecuting attorney. Everybody admitted that it was an extraordinary case, but the press was consistent in its clamor against Flechter, and opinion generally was that he had been rightly convicted. On May 22 he was sentenced to the penitentiary for 12 months, but, after being incarcerated in the Tombs for 3 weeks, he secured a certificate of reasonable doubt and a stay until his conviction could be reviewed on appeal. Then he gave bail and was released. But he had been in jail. Flechter will never forget that. And, for the time being at least, his reputation was gone, his family disgraced, and his business ruined. A calm reading of the record of the trial suggests that the case abounded in doubts more or less reasonable, and that the court might well have taken it from the jury on that account. But a printed page of questions and answers carries with it no more than a suggestion of the value of testimony, the real significance of which lies in the manner in which it is given, the tone of the voice and the flash of the eye. Once again Flechter sat at his desk in the window behind the great gilded fiddle. To him, as to its owner, the great Stradivarius had brought only sorrow. But for him the world had no pity. Surely the strains of this wonderful instrument must have had a dying fall even when played by the loving hand of old Jean Bott. At last, after several years, in 1899, the case came up in the appellate division of the Supreme Court. Flechter had been led to believe that his conviction would undoubtedly be reversed and a new trial ordered, which would be tantamount to an acquittal, for it was hardly likely in such an event that a second trial would be considered advisable upon the same evidence. But to his great disappointment, his conviction was sustained by a divided court, in which only 2 of the 5 justices voted for a new trial. Again fortune had averted her face. If only one more judge had thought the evidence insufficient. The great gilded fiddle seemed to Flechter an omen of misfortune. Once more he gave bail, this time in $5,000, and was set at liberty pending his appeal to the highest court in the state. Once more he took his seat in his office and tried to carry on his business. But time had dragged on. People had forgotten all about Flechter and the lost Stradivarius, and when his conviction was affirmed little notice was taken of the fact. It was generally assumed that having been sentenced he was in jail. Then something happened which once more dragged Flechter into the limelight. Editors rushed to their files and dusted the cobwebs off the issues containing the accounts of the trial. The sign of the Gilded Fiddle became the daily center of a throng of excited musicians, lawyers, and reporters. The lost Stradivarius, the great Duke of Cambridge, the nemesis of Bott and of Flechter, was found by Flechter himself, as he claimed, on August 17, 1900. According to the dealer and his witnesses, the amazing discovery occurred in this wise. A violin maker named Joseph Farr, who at one time had worked for Flechter and had testified in his behalf at the trial, to the effect that the instrument produced in the police court was not Bott's Stradivarius, saw by chance a very fine violin in the possession of a family named Springer in Brooklyn, and notified Flechter of the fact. The latter, who was always ready to purchase choice violins, after vainly trying for a long time to induce the Springers to bring it to New York, called with Farr upon Mrs. Springer and asked to examine it. To his utter astonishment, she produced for his inspection Bott's long-lost Stradivarius. Hardly able to control his excitement, Flechter immediately returned to New York and reported the discovery to the police, who instantly began a thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding its discovery. The district attorney's office and the detective bureau were at first highly suspicious of this opportune discovery on the part of a convicted felon of the precise evidence necessary to clear him, but it was soon demonstrated to their pretty general satisfaction that the famous Stradivarius had in fact been pawned in the shop of one Benjamin Fox on the very day and within an hour of the theft, together with its case and 2 bows, for the insignificant sum of $4. After the legal period of redemption had expired, it had been put up at auction and bid in by the pawnbroker for a small advance over the sum for which it had been pawned. It lay exposed for purchase on Fox's shelf for some months, until, in December 1895, a tailor named James Dooley visited the shop to redeem a silver watch. Being, at the same time, in funds, and able to satisfy his taste as a virtuoso, he felt the need of and bought a violin for $10, but, Fox urging upon him the desirability of getting a good one while he was about it, was finally persuaded to purchase the bought violin for $20 in its stead. Dooley took it home, played upon it as the spirit moved, and whenever in need of ready money brought it back to Fox as security, always redeeming it in time to prevent its sale. One day, being at Mrs. Springer's, where he was accustomed to purchase tailor trimmings, he offered it to her for sale, and, as her son was taking violin lessons, induced her to buy it for $30. and in the house of the Springers. It had quietly remained ever since, while lawyers and prosecutors wrangled and thundered and witnesses swore positively to the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, to prove that Flechter stole the violin and tried to sell it to Durden. On these facts, which did not seem to admit of contradiction, Recorder Goff ordered an oral examination of all the witnesses, the hearing of which, sandwiched in between the current trials in his court, dragged along for months, but which finally resulted in establishing to the court's satisfaction that the violin discovered in the possession of the Springers was the genuine Duke of Cambridge, and that it could not have been in Flechter's possession at the time. He was arrested on July 7, 1902, 8 years after Bott's death and the arrest and indictment of Flechter for the theft of the violin. A picturesque group assembled in the General Sessions. There was Flechter and his lawyer, Mrs. Springer, and her son, the attorneys for the prosecution, and lastly old Mrs. Bott. The seals of the case were broken and the violin identified by the widow as that of her husband. The Springers waived all claim to the violin, and the court dismissed the indictment against the defendant and ordered the Stradivarius to be delivered to Mrs. Bott. With these words, "Mrs. Bott, it affords very great pleasure to the court to give the violin to you. You have suffered many years of sorrow and trouble in regard to it." 8 years, sighed the old lady, clasping the violin in her arms. "I wish you a great deal of pleasure in its possession," continued the recorder. Thus ended, as a matter of record, the case of the people against Flechter. For 8 years the violin dealer and his family had endured the agony of disgrace. He had spent a fortune in his defense, and had nevertheless been convicted of a crime of which he was at last proved innocent. Yet, there are those who, when the case is mentioned, shake their heads wisely, as if to say that the whole story of the lost Stradivarius has never been told. 4. The last of the wire-tappers. "Sir," replied the knave unabashed, "I am one of those who do make a living by their wits." John Felix, a dealer in automatic musical instruments in New York City, was swindled out of $50,000 on February 2, 1905, by what is commonly known as the wire-tapping game. During the previous August, a man calling himself by the name of Nelson had hired room 46, in a building at 27 East 22nd Street, as a school for wireless telegraphy. Later on he had installed over a dozen deal tables, each fitted with a complete set of ordinary telegraph instruments and connected with wires which, while apparently passing out of the windows, in reality plunged behind a desk into a small dry battery. Each table was fitted with a shaded electric drop light, and the room was furnished with the ordinary paraphernalia of a telegraph office. The janitor never observed any activity in the school. There seemed to be no pupils, and no one haunted the place except a short, ill-favored person who appeared monthly and paid the rent. On the afternoon of February 1, 1905, Mr. Felix was called to the telephone of his store and asked to make an appointment later in the afternoon, with a gentleman named Nelson who desired to submit to him a business proposition. 15 minutes afterward Mr. Nelson arrived in person and introduced himself as having met Felix at Lou Ludlam's gambling house. He then produced a copy of the Evening Telegram which contained an article to the effect that the Western Union Telegraph Company was about to resume its pool room service, that is to say, to supply the pool rooms with the telegraphic returns of the various horse races being run in different parts of the United States. The paper also contained, in connection with this item of news, a photograph which might, by a stretch of the imagination, have been taken to resemble Nelson himself. Mr. Felix, who was a German gentleman of French sympathies, married to an American lady, had recently returned to America after a 10-year sojourn in Europe. He had had an extensive commercial career, was possessed of a considerable fortune, and had at length determined to settle in New York, where he could invest his money to advantage and at the same time conduct a conservative and harmonious business in musical instruments. Like the Teutons of old, dwelling among the forests of the Elbe, Mr. Felix knew the fascination of games of chance, and he had heard the merry song of the wheel at both Hamburg and Monte Carlo. In Europe the pleasures of the gaming table had been comparatively inexpensive, but in New York for some unknown reason the fickle goddess had not favored him, and he had lost upward of $51,000. Zeu. Veal. As he himself expressed it. Being of a philosophic disposition, however, he had pocketed his losses and contented himself with the consoling thought that, whereas he might have lost all, he had in fact lost only a part. It might well have been that had not the tempter appeared in the person of his afternoon visitor, he would have remained in status quo for the rest of his natural life. In the sunny window of his musical store, surrounded by zitherns, auto harps, dulcimers, psalteries, sackbuts, and other instruments of melody, the advent of Nelson produced the effect of a sudden and unexpected discord. Felix distrusted him from the very first. The proposition was simplicity itself. It appeared that Mr. Nelson was in the employ of the Western Union Telegraph Company, which had just opened a branch office for racing news at 27 East 22nd Street. This branch was under the superintendence of an old associate and intimate friend of Nelson's by the name of McPherson. Assuming that they could find someone with the requisite amount of cash, they could all make their everlasting fortunes by simply having McPherson withhold the news of some race from the pool rooms long enough to allow one of the others to place a large bet upon some horse, which had in fact already won and was resting comfortably in the stable. Felix grasped the idea instantly. At the same time he had his suspicions of his visitor. It seemed peculiar that he, an inconspicuous citizen who had already lost $50,000 in gambling houses, should be selected as the recipient of such a momentous opportunity. Moreover, he knew very well that gentlemen in gambling houses were never introduced at all. He thought he detected the odor of a rodent. He naively inquired why, if all these things were so, Nelson and his friend were not already yet millionaires 2 or 3 times. The answer was at once forthcoming. That they had been, but also had been robbed, unmercifully robbed, by one in whom they had had confidence and to whom they had entrusted their money. And now we are poor, penniless clerks, sighed Nelson, and if we should offer to make a big bet ourselves, the gamblers would be suspicious and probably refuse to place it. I think this looks like a schwindling game, said Felix shrewdly. So it did, so it was. By and by Felix put on his hat and, escorted by Nelson, paid a visit to the branch office at 27 East 22nd Street, where once solitude had reigned supreme and the spider had spun his web amid the fast-gathering dust. All was now tumultuous activity. 15 busy operators in eye shades and shirt sleeves took the news hot from the humming wires and clicked it off to the waiting pool rooms. Scarecrow wins by a neck, cried one, Blackbird second. Make the odds 5-3, shouted a short, ill-favored man, who sat at a desk, puffing a large black cigar. The place buzzed like a beehive and ticked like a clockmaker's. It had an atmosphere of breathless excitement all its own. Felix watched and marveled, wondering if dreams came true. The short, ill-favored man strolled over and condescended to make Mr. Felix's acquaintance. An hour later the three of them were closeted among the zitherns. At the same moment the 15 operators were ranged in a line in front of a neighboring bar, their elbows simultaneously elevated at an angle of 45 degrees. Felix still had lingering doubts. Hadn't Mr. McPherson some little paper, a letter, a bill, a receipt, or a check, to show that he was really in the employ of the Western Union? No, said Mac, but he had something better, the badge which he had received as the fastest operator among the company's employees. Felix wanted to see it, but Mac explained that it was locked up in the vault at the Farmers Loan and Trust Co. To Felix this had a safe sound, Farmers Trust Co. Then matters began to move rapidly. It was arranged that Felix should go down in the morning and get $50,000 from his bankers, Seligman and Meyer. After that he was to meet Nelson at the store and go with him to the pool room, where the big financiers played their money. McPherson was to remain at the office and telephone them the results of the races in advance. By nightfall they would be worth $500,000. I hope you have a good large safe, remarked Nelson, tentatively. The three conspirators parted with mutual expressions of confidence and esteem. Next morning Mr. Felix went to his bankers and procured $50,000 in 5 house and dollar bills. The day passed very slowly. There was not even a flurry in zitherns. He waited impatiently for Nelson, who was to come at 5 o'clock. At last Nelson arrived and they hurried to the Fifth Avenue Hotel where the coup was to take place. And now another marvel. Wasserman Brothers stockbrokering office, which closes at 3 hummed just as the office had done the evening before, and with the very same bees, although Felix did not recognize them. It was crowded with men who struggled violently with one another in their eagerness to force their bets into the hands of a benevolent-looking person, who, Felix was informed, was the trusted cashier of the establishment. And the sums were so large that even Felix gasped. "Make that $40,000 on cocoa," cried a bald-headed capper. "Mr. Gates wants to double his bet on Jack Stone, make it $80,000,000, shrieked another. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," begged the trusted cashier, "not quite so fast, if you please. One at a time. 60,000 on Hesper for a place," bawled one addressed as Mr. Keene. While Messrs. Ryan, Whitney, Belmont, Sullivan, McCarran, and Murphy all made handsome wagers. From time to time a sporty-looking man standing beside a ticker shouted the odds and read off the returns. Felix heard with straining ears. "They're off. Baby leads at the quarter. Susan is gaining. They're on the stretch. Satan wins by a nose, Peter second." There was a deafening uproar, hats were tossed ceilingward, and great wads of money were passed out by the trusted cashier to indifferent millionaires. Felix wanted to rush in and bet at once on something. If he waited it might be too late. Was it necessary to be introduced to the cashier? No. Would he take the bet? All right, but at that moment a page elbowed his way among the money, calling plaintively for Felix. Mr. Felix. Shrinking at the thought of such publicity in such distinguished company, Felix caught the boy's arm and learned that he was wanted at the telephone booth in the hotel. "It must be Mac," said Nelson. "Now don't make any mistake." Felix promised to use the utmost care. It was Mac. "Is this Mr. Felix?" "Yes." "Well, be very careful now. I am going to give you the result of the third race, which has already been run. I will hold back the news 3 minutes. This is merely to see if everything is working right. Don't make any bet. If I give you the winners correctly, you can put your money on the fourth race. The horse that won the last is Col. Starbottle Don Juan is second. Now just step back and see if I am right. Felix rushed back to the pool room. As he entered, the man at the tape was calling out that they were off. In due course they reached the quarter and then the half. A terrific struggle was in progress between Col. Starbottle and Don Juan. First one was ahead and then the other. Finally they came thundering down to the stretch, Col. Starbottle winning by a neck. Gates won $90,000, and several others pocketed wads running anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000. Felix hurried back to the telephone. Mac was at the other end. "Now write this down," admonished McPherson, "we can't afford to have any mistake. Old Stone has just won the fourth race, with Calvert second. Play Old Stone to win at 5-1. We shall make $250,000 and Old Stone is safe in the stable all the time and his jockey is smoking a cigarette on the clubhouse veranda. Good luck, old man." Felix had some difficulty in getting near the trusted cashier, so many financiers were betting on Calvert. Felix smiled to himself. He'd show them a thing or two. Finally he managed to push his envelope containing the five $10,000 bills into the trusted cashier's hand. The latter marked it Old Stone, 5-1 to win, and thrust it into his pocket. Then Whitney or somebody bet $70,000 on Calvert. "They're off," shouted the man at the tape. How he lived while they tore around the course Felix never knew. Neck and neck Old Stone and Calvert passed the quarter, the half, and the three-quarter post, and with the crowd yelling like demons came hurtling down the stretch. "Old Stone wins!" cried the booster at the tape in a voice husky with excitement. Calvert a close second. Felix nearly fainted. His head swam. He had won $250,000. Then the voice of the booster made itself audible above the confusion. "What? A mistake? Not possible, yes. Owing to some confusion at the finish. Both jockeys wearing the same colors, the official returns now read Calvert first. Old Stone second." Among the zitherns Felix sat and wondered if he had been swindled. He had not returned to Wasserman Brothers. Had he done so he would have found it empty 5 minutes after he had lost his money. The millionaires were already streaming hilariously into Sharkey's. Gates pledged Belmont and Keene pledged Whitney. Each had earned $5 by the sweat of his brow. The glorious army of wiretappers had won another victory and their generals had consummated a campaign of months. Expenses, roughly, $600. Receipts, $50,000. Net profits, $48,400. Share of each, $16,133. A day or two later Felix wandered down to police headquarters, and in the rogues gallery identified the photograph of Nelson, whom he then discovered to be none other than William Crane, alias John Lawson, alias John Larson, a well-known wiretapper, arrested some dozen times within a year or two for similar offenses. McPherson turned out to be Christopher Tracy, alias Charles J. Tracy, alias Charles Tompkins, alias Topping, alias Toppin, etc., arrested some 8 or 10 times for wiretapping. The trusted cashier materialized in the form of one Wyatt, alias Fred Williams, etc., a wiretapper and pal of Chappie Moran and Larry Summerfield. Detective Sergeants Fogarty and Mundy were at once detailed upon the case and arrested within a short time both Nelson and McPherson. the trusted cashier who had pocketed Felix's $50,000, has never been caught. It is said that he is running a first-class hostelry in a western city. But that is another story. When Acting Inspector O'Brien ordered Macpherson brought into his private room, the latter unhesitatingly admitted that the three of them had trimmed Felix of his $50,000, exactly as the latter had alleged. He stated that Wyatt, alias Williams, was the one who had taken in the money, that it was still in his possession, and still intact in its original form. He denied, however, any knowledge of Wyatt's whereabouts. The reason for this indifference became apparent when the two prisoners were arraigned in the magistrate's court, and their counsel demanded their instant discharge on the ground that they had committed no crime for which they could be prosecuted. He cited an old New York case, McCord vs. The People, to which seemed in a general way to sustain his contention, and which had been followed by another and much more recent decision, The People vs. Livingston. 3. The first of these cases had gone to the Court of Appeals, and the general doctrine had been enunciated that where a person parts with his money for an unlawful or dishonest purpose, even though he is tricked into so doing by false pretenses, a prosecution for the crime of larceny cannot be maintained. 246 New York 470. 347 App. Div 283. In the McCord case, the defendant had falsely pretended to the complainant, a man named Miller, that he was a police officer and held a warrant for his arrest. By these means he had induced Miller to give him a gold watch and a diamond ring as the price of his liberty. The conviction in this case was reversed on the ground that Miller parted with his property for an unlawful purpose, but there was a very strong dissenting opinion from Mr. Justice Peckham, now a member of the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States. In the second case, that of Livingston, the complainant had been defrauded out of $500 by means of the green goods game, but this conviction was reversed by the Appellate Division of the Second Department on the authority of the McCord case. The opinion in this case was written by Mr. Justice Cullen, now Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, who says in conclusion, "We very much regret being compelled to reverse this conviction. Even if the prosecutor intended to deal in counterfeit money, that is no reason why the appellant should go unwhipped of justice. We venture to suggest that it might be well for the legislature to alter the rule laid down in McCord vs. People. Well might the judges regret being compelled to set a rogue at liberty simply because he had been ingenious enough to invent a fraud, very likely with the assistance of a shyster lawyer, which involved the additional turpitude of seducing another into a criminal conspiracy. Livingston was turned loose upon the community in spite of the fact that he had swindled a man out of $500, because he had incidentally led the latter to believe that in return he was to receive counterfeit money or green goods, which might be put into circulation. Yet, because some years before, the judges of the Court of Appeals had, in the McCord matter, adopted the rule followed in civil cases, to wit that as the complaining witness was himself in fault and did not come into court with clean hands, he could have no standing before them. The appellate division in the next case felt obliged to follow them and to rule tantamount to saying that two wrongs could make a right and two knaves one honest man. It may seem a trifle unfair to put it in just this way, but when one realizes the iniquity of such a doctrine as applied to criminal cases, it is hard to speak softly. Thus the broad and general doctrine seemed to be established that so long as a thief could induce his victim to believe that it was to his advantage to enter into a dishonest transaction, he might defraud him to any extent in his power. Immediately there sprang into being hordes of swindlers, who, aided by adroit shyster lawyers, invented all sorts of schemes which involved some sort of dishonesty upon the part of the person to be defrauded. The wiretappers, of whom Larry Summerfield was the Napoleon, the gold brick and green goods man, and the sick engineers flocked to New York, which, under the unwitting protection of the Court of Appeals, became a veritable mecca for persons of their ilk. To readers unfamiliar with the cast of mind of professional criminals it will be almost impossible to appreciate with what bold insouciance these vultures now hovered over the metropolitan barnyard. Had not the Court of Appeals itself recognized their profession? They had nothing to fear. The law was on their side. They walked the streets flaunting their immunity in the very face of the police. Wiretapping became an industry, a legalized industry with which the authorities might interfere at their peril. Indeed, there is one instance in which a wiretapper successfully prosecuted his victim, after he had trimmed him, upon a charge of grand larceny arising out of the same transaction. One crook bred another every time he made a victim, and the disease of crime, the most infectious of all distempers, ate its way unchecked into the body politic. Broadway was thronged by a prosperous gentry, the aristocracy and elite of knavery, who dressed resplendently, flourished like the green bay tree, and spent their, or rather their victims, money with the lavish hand of one of Dumas's gentlemen. But the evil did not stop there. Seeing that their brothers prospered in New York, and neither being learned in the law nor gifted with the power of nice discrimination between rogueries, all the other knaves in the country took it for granted that they had at last found the Elysian fields and came trooping here by hundreds to ply their various trades. The McCord case stood out like a cabalistic sign upon a gatepost telling all the rascals who passed that way that the city was full of honest folk waiting to be turned into rogues and trimmed. And presently we did pass a narrow lane, and at the mouth espied a written stone, telling beggars by a word like a wee pitchfork to go that way. The tip went abroad that the city was good graft for everybody, and in the train of the wiretappers thronged the flim-flammer, confidence man, booster, capper and every sort of affiliated crook, recalling Charles Reade's account in The Cloister and the Hearth of Gerard in Lorraine among their kin of another period. With them and all they had, 'twas lightly come and lightly go, and when we left them my master said to me, "This is thy first lesson, but tonight we shall be at Hansburg. Come with me to the Rotboss there, and I'll show thee all our folk, and their lays, and especially the Losnas, the Dutzers, the Schleppers, the Gickisses, the Schwanfelders, whom in England we call shivering jemmies, the Suntragers, the Schweigers, the Joners, the Cecildeggers, the Genskirers, in France Marcandiers, the Varanarans, the Stabulars, with a few foreigners like ourselves, such as Pieters, Frank Maitu, Polis sons, Malingruas, Traders, Rufflers, Whipjacks, Domerars, Glimmerars, Jarkmen, Patricos, Swatters, Autumn Morts, Walking Morts, Inel. Cried I, stopping him, art as gleesome as the evil one accounting of his imps. I'll jot down in my tablet all these caitiffs and their accursed names, for knowledge is knowledge. But go among them alive or dead, that will I not with my good will. And a large part of it was due simply to the fact that 7 learned men upon 7 comfortable chairs in the city of Albany had said, many years ago, that neither the law or public policy designs the protection of rogues in their dealings with each other, or to ensure fair dealing and truthfulness as between each other, in their dishonest practices. The reason that the wiretapping game was supposed to come within the scope of the McCord case was this: it deluded the victim into the belief that he was going to cheat the pool room by placing a bet upon a sure thing. Secondarily, it involved, as the dupe supposed, the theft or disclosure of messages which were being transmitted over the lines of a telegraph company, a misdemeanor. Hence, it was argued, the victim was as much a thief as the proposer of the scheme, had parted with his money for a dishonest purpose, did not come into court with clean hands, and no prosecution could be sustained, no matter whether he had been led to give up his money by means of false pretenses or not. While wiretapping differed technically from the precise frauds committed by McCord and Livingston, it nevertheless closely resembled those swindlers in general character and came clearly within the doctrine that the law was not designed to protect rogues in their dealings with each other. No genuine attempt had ever been made to prosecute one of these gentry until the catastrophe which deprived Felix of his $50,000. The wiretappers rolled in money. Indeed, the fraternity were so liberal with their rolls that they became friendly with certain police officials and intimately affiliated with various politicians of influence, a friend of one of whom went on Summerfield's bond when the latter was being prosecuted for the sick engineer frauds to the extent of $30,000. They regularly went to Europe in the summer season and could be seen at all the race courses and gambling resorts of the continent. It is amusing to chronicle in this connection that just prior to Macpherson's arrest, that is to say during the summer vacation of 1904, he crossed the Atlantic on the same steamer with an assistant district attorney of New York County, who failed to recognize his ship companion and found him an entertaining and agreeable comrade. The trial came on before Judge Warren W. Foster in Part 3 of the General Sessions on February 27, 1906. A special panel quickly supplied a jury, which, after hearing the evidence, returned in short order a verdict of guilty. As Judge Foster believed the McCord case to be still the law of the state, he, of his own motion, and with commendable independence, immediately arrested judgment. The people thereupon appealed, the Court of Appeals sustained Judge Foster, and the defendant was discharged. It is, however, satisfactory to record that the legislature at its next session amended the penal code in such a way as to entirely deprive the wiretappers and their kind of the erstwhile protection which they had enjoyed under the law.